Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for National Security Studies, the INSS in Tel Aviv. My name is Itai Brun and I'm the Deputy Director of INSS for Research and Analysis, and I'm proud and excited to open the second annual conference of the Lippkin-Shahak program that deals with national security and democracy in an era of post-truth and fake news. The title of this conference is National Security, Fake News and Strategic Communication, and this conference is an outcome of INSS collaboration with two of the leading and most distinguished institutions in the world. Today, the first day of the conference is in collaboration with King's College Center for Strategic Communications located in London. And the second day, next Thursday, November 19, will be done in collaboration with the American RAND Corporation. We have a fascinating program for you. Today we will have two panels. One will deal with Disinformation 2020, actors, threats, possible solutions. And the second will deal with memory construction and strategic communications. But there is no better way to open this conference than with an interview I conducted a few days ago with Michael Rich, the president and CEO of RAND Corporation. Michael is also leading a RAND program that is titled Truth Decay, dealing with the diminishing role of facts and analysis in American public life. We are proud to have him with us, and let's hear the interview that was recorded just before the network's announcement of Joe Biden's victory. So we are using different terms, but I think that practically, probably we are referring to the same issue. So how do you define the term truth decay, and what is its importance, in your view, in the American context and in the global context?
Well, let me start by saying that I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. We know we've had many interactions, associations here at RAND with INSS, and it's always delighted to participate in these kinds of discussions. You noted that we define truth decay as the diminishing role of facts and analysis in public life. It's made up of four trends. First, the increasing disagreement about objective facts and data. Second, blurring of the line between facts and opinion. The third is increasing relative volume, and therefore we believe the relative influence of opinions over facts. And finally, declining trust in key institutions, especially institutions that had previously been looked at as sources of facts and data. Our research shows that truth decay in the United States has grown more serious and more pervasive over the last 2 decades. Americans are confronted by a deluge of misinformation, disinformation that's enabled by technology, social media, and a traditional news industry that's driven by economic incentives to increasingly blur the line between fact and opinion. And the consequence is that many individuals no longer trust the government or other established institutions and don't know where to turn to for reliable information. And as a result, there's skepticism and disagreement about objective facts and analysis that underlie important policy discussions, whether it be about the safety of vaccines, about the effects and consequences of human-driven climate change, the safety of genetically modified foods, the benefits and costs of immigration, and the list goes on. This disagreement makes it impossible to make steady progress on our major policy challenges. Up until now, we've studied the trends, the causes, and the consequences in the United States, but we're also examining truth decay in a global context, and one of our future reports will study whether or not we see the same truth decay trends in Europe.
I can tell you that we definitely see the same trends, the same characteristics in Israel, and we will probably discuss it in the future. But I have a question. I understand the characteristics, but what is, in your opinion, the true impact? How can you measure the impact of these characteristics, these four characteristics, on the public ability to clarify reality, to understand reality? What is the real impact of truth decay?
Well, it starts with the erosion of civil discourse. And by that, I mean the ability to have meaningful discussion or debate about an important topic with someone with whom you disagree. When that civil discourse erodes in government settings, it leads to dysfunction. We've seen in the United States, and occasionally, and some people might say often, it leads to gridlock or paralysis. And this gridlock or paralysis makes solving the most complex problems, achieving the most important aims in the public sector virtually impossible. So you imagine reforming a social program, planning and carrying out a major infrastructure program, sustaining a strategic competition with an adversary. In the past, those sustained challenges have been met through compromise and consensus, not a zigzag path of repeal and replace actions back and forth. And if our society and our elected representatives cannot agree on a common set of facts, we're not going to be able to make progress on key issues like healthcare and immigration and homelessness and many others that face us.
Thanks. You're emphasizing the impact, the implications of truth decay mainly on the public, on the general public, on the society. We at INSS are emphasizing the same characteristics. We are emphasizing their implications on the decision makers, on the people in the security, national security rooms. Our main argument is that these rooms are not immune. They also suffer from growing difficulty to clarify and understand reality. What is your opinion on this matter, on the impact on the decision makers, the president, our prime minister, the key principals?
Well, I think it affects decision makers the same way it does, it affects other members of society. The volume of disinformation, our own cognitive biases, the way humans are hardwired to access and seek out information and use it to make decisions, the way in which the media blurs the lines between fact and opinion, that can make it hard for individuals anywhere to A, find the factual information they need, even when they're looking for it, and B, process all the various pieces of information that one has to process in order to make a complex decision. And so I applaud your emphasis or your focus on the implications of truth decay for senior government officials and senior military leaders. You're
describing periods or waves of truth decay. And I want to ask you if we might be in some kind of a wave that we will sometime end. And I want to connect it with what we saw in recent months concerning the public and the media and the social networks reaction toward the COVID-19. And we saw, I think, from my perspective, we saw the desire of the public, an unusual desire of the public to understand what is really happening, to clarify the facts. We saw the media trying to mediate reality to the public, sometimes even, at least in Israel, giving up rating consideration. We saw the social media taking responsibility, directing the users to fact checkers, to official sites and so on. So is it possible that we are toward the end of this period, of this wave? Are we in the beginning of the end of the beginning, or we are just at the beginning of this period?
Well, it's a good question. I wish you could answer it. I think my answer is none of the above.
Okay.
We know we're not at the beginning. We've been watching this worsen in the United States, at least, for almost 2 decades. There are some indications that we might be at a turning point. One would think that the worldwide threat and consequences of the pandemic might serve that purpose. But I think there are some other indications that things seem to be worsening. In fact, there's little indication that we really made much sustainable headway yet in addressing the challenges related to truth decay. So I think it's safer to say we're solidly in the middle of this particular period of truth decay, and what we do or don't do in the near future could make a big difference in the direction that we end up moving as democratic societies.
And it's really dramatic days and dramatic hours in the United States. What do you think? How do you evaluate the impact of truth decay on the US election, on the current dramatic events concerning the US election?
Well, I think we saw substantial evidence of truth decay at work during the election. We saw, a huge volume of information, both facts and analysis and opinions. We saw, I think, a blurring of the line between facts and opinion. Often all news channels are filled up with people exchanging opinions, and so it's difficult in our various media to distinguish the two. By the way, facts and opinion, they're both information, they're both valuable, but they're not the same, and people need to have the ability to tell them apart. So we saw the blurring of the line, the explosion in the volume of opinion, and some uncertainty and distrust among American voters and more broadly citizens, some uncertainty about where to turn for reliable information. And one of the things I think that makes it so challenging here in the United States is our research shows that it's not a phenomenon that is confined to a particular geographic region of our country. It's not something that characterizes one particular demographic group, an age group, for example. It's not something that is limited to just one of our two major political parties. And so this is really a systemic problem that relates to the causes that we outline in our research. Cognitive biases that are part of human nature, the vast changes in the information landscape that are continuing, the failure, frankly, of our education system to, in a way, keep pace with these changes, and then the extensive and growing polarization in our society, not just political polarization, but social polarization and economic polarization, all of which combine and reinforce each other to make it easier to both create for yourself and sustain these information bubbles that fail to expose us to conflicting information.
Thank you. And maybe finally, we are both think tanks. What do you think is the role of think tanks in the effort to cope truth decay?
Well, because of the existential danger posed by truth decay, I believe that nonpartisan, nonprofit think tanks like RAND are more important than ever. One of our former trustees, a former public official in the United States, Newton Minow, reminded me that RAND was created in 1948. Actually, the same day, it turns out, as the State of Israel, May 14th. The purpose then was to help address the existential threat of that time, the Soviet Union and its nuclear arsenal. And he went on to say that truth decay is the existential threat of our time. And I believe that, and that's why I've committed RAND to leading the fight against this threat, the fight to put facts and analysis back at the center of public discourse and public policy making. If not RAND, then who? We can't do it alone, and that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted that major institutions like INSS are joining in the fight with us.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this fascinating interview. We are sharing the same perspective, and we are trying to lead the same effort in Israel. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and let me say that I look forward to further discussions, debates, and collaborations.
Thank you very much. Welcome back. We are back live at the INSS Liפקין-שחק conference, and we are in the first panel. This panel is going to deal with disinformation and what we learned about disinformation in 2020. Who are the actors? What are the threats? And are there any relevant solutions? The Liפקין-שחק program is dealing with national security and democracy in the era of post-truth and fake news. The term post-truth entered our discourse in 2016 after the Brexit, after the US election, when the Oxford Dictionary decided to choose post-truth as its word of the year, defining post-truth as a political culture in which beliefs, opinions, feelings, emotions are more influential than facts. At the same time, we started to use the term fake news, first as part of the political debate, Trump accusing CNN of disseminating fake news, and then also in the academic discourse to define the ease to disseminate in large scale errors, mistakes, lies, spins, conspiracy theories. The US election in 2016 demonstrated to many that this situation is not only the natural outcome of technological, political, economic, social, and ideological processes, but also a result of a deliberate dissemination effort made by a wide range of actors. All this leads, of course, to increasing difficulty, to growing difficulty to clarify reality, to understand reality, and by that, this difficulty undermines the foundations of our democracy and our national security. So exactly 4 years later, we are here in this panel, and this panel is supposed to deal with what we learned since then, and especially in 2020. And no doubt that 2020 gave us at least 3 main learning opportunities. First and foremost, the US election, then prior to that, COVID-19, which according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, was accompanied by infodemic, spreading rumors and false information. And finally, also in the demonstrations, the social unrest that we see in different places around the world, including the United States, Israel, and Europe. So we'll start this discussion with Nina Jankowitz. Nina is a disinformation fellow for the independent research group at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC. Nina, good afternoon, our time. You recently published your book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. So what is the disinformation war? Who are the fighting sides of this war? And in your opinion, how did it affect the US election?
Thank you so much for having me this morning or this afternoon where you are. It's really a delight to be here on this panel with so many distinguished voices in this space. When I set out to write my book, How to Lose the Information War, I was really looking at Russian disinformation and Russian disinformation as targeted toward the West. But the main conclusion of the book is really not about Russian disinformation. It's about the fissures in our societies that are exploited not only by our foreign adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, but also by opportunistic individuals, often on the political spectrum, sometimes working for profit, here in our domestic information environments. And I think, although of course, I would have preferred not to release my book during a pandemic, the last couple of months have really shown how important those conclusions are. The fact that we need to look inward if we're going to win the information war. There will always be opportunistic adversaries, foreign and domestic, who are trying to weaponize the fissures in our societies. Things like systemic racism, economic inequality, the urban-rural divide, pitting populations against one another. But if we build up our resilience internally, we'll have a much better time countering those adversaries. We can't just play whack-a-troll, deleting fake accounts, deleting harmful content. And we've seen that in this election, frankly. We've seen efforts by the social media companies to clamp down on information, to change very, in the short term, their content moderation policies, things like that. But ultimately, the most harmful disinformation during this past couple of months, I would say, especially ramping up over the summer since May or June, has come from inside the house. It's come from our own politicians, our own commentators and influencers. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing the foreign adversaries echoing. They don't need to be as creative or use as much brute force this time around. All they really need to do is hit retweet on something that President Trump puts out there, right? And again, those most harmful narratives that we've seen this year are coming from domestic sources, the things that are inspiring online harms to turn into offline violence, whether that's, militias organizing to kidnap the governor of Michigan, or people going to counting centers as the results of the election are being certified to intimidate election and poll workers. We've seen death threats about this stuff. And so, it's really important to recognize these domestic harms that exist. And if we're going to address them, and I'm sure we'll get to this today, we can't really separate the foreign disinformation from the domestic stuff. They are holistic. They are two sides of the same coin. And so in my work, based on what I've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, countries that have been dealing with this threat, not only as a foreign policy and national security problem, but something domestically that's been going on for a long time as well, they have really invested in what I call citizens-based solutions. So yes, countries like Estonia have increased their cyber defenses, but they're also investing in their populations. They're investing in teaching media and digital literacy and civics. They're investing in education. A lot of what you just talked about in the opening interview deals with that, giving people the tools they need to navigate today's information environment, which is increasingly chaotic and may or may not have this concept of truth decay, really being pervasive at this point. So I think I want to leave it there to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion and to hear from everyone else. But I would say the information war is no longer something that has this foreign domestic dichotomy. We are in this very globalized information environment. And in order to protect our national security, our democratic discourse, we need to think about the local environment, think about ourselves, and look a little bit inward as we try to deal with this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Since you mentioned that it's coming from the outside and from the inside, I want to ask a short question. It's a little bit philosophical, but I think it's practical. So if it's coming from the outside and the inside, who are we? We're talking about we that should cope with it. Who are we?
Right. Well, okay. So here we are, a bunch of think tank folks. When I say we, I'm talking about policymakers, right? But this affects ordinary citizens as well. A democracy doesn't work without access to authoritative, trustworthy information. And we've seen that breaking down in this election cycle here in the United States. So if we want to have a really robust democracy in the future, if policymakers, if citizens want to invest in that, we need to demand from our elected officials that, this sort of behavior gets disincentivized, not normalized, as we've seen over the past 4 years. And we can do that at the ballot box. We can do that through legislation that increases transparency and oversight over some of the practices on social media platforms. And we can do it through campaign legislation. We don't have a lot of restrictions here in the United States about what candidates can and cannot say, and the types of rhetoric they can use, the types of things that they can pay to amplify on social media. And I think those are the hard conversations that we're going to start to have over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Nina. Yochai Benkler is a professor and co-director at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. Hi, Yochai. Well, probably you agree with Nina that at least some of the threat is coming from the inside. So how does this actually happen? And do you think that since you are putting the blame on at least some of the media, part of the media, do you think that what happened prior and after the elections with the social networks, with the television outlets? Does this change anything?
So I know that you want to go to does this change anything, but you have to admit, I reject the entire 15 minutes you had with Rich. This parallelism. There's cognitive bias, there's social media, there's lack of trust. There is a specific dynamic. I'm sorry, back up. I'm now working from 5 years of observing, at this point, 8 million stories, tens of millions of tweets, working with a network of researchers who publish in Science and the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences and Science Advances, on my own Oxford University Press published book. It's frustrating not to be able to get through. The United States is suffering an asymmetric polarization. It is coming from a specific market dynamic that has been in play since the 1980s, in which one part of the nation is operating in a propaganda feedback loop. The Russians are beside the point. They're a rounding error. They're not two sides of a coin, they're a rounding error. Fundamentally, what's driving it is Fox News, talk radio, associated around them with online media. Anyone who tries to explain disinformation, call it truth decay, call it whatever you want, information disorder in the United States, who doesn't start with the network on which the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee can sit on the most popular television show and say Philadelphia is like an oily snake, and they stole the election in Pennsylvania, and everybody claps their hands, is just looking in the wrong place, is wasting all of our time. So and the reason that I'm speaking the way that I'm speaking is because I've been publishing this for years. You have pieces in Science showing you that fake news was very focused in over 65-year-old conservatives. And we hear all of this neutral thing. So is something important happening? Yes. Fox News in the last 10 days, from the election and on, has tried to actually counteract. The New York Post, which became a real complement to the disinformation and one of the major sources of mail-in ballot fraud disinformation that got circulated, also seems to be pulling back. So the Murdoch properties are pulling back, but the entire Republican leadership, from the Senate Majority Leader and the House Minority Leader, through the Senate Judiciary Chair, through the prospective 2020, are telling the American people lies in order to undermine the legitimacy of the election. Who are we? We are people who care about democracy and want it to survive an attack by an ethno-nationalist, race-baiting party operating within a mass media propaganda loop and getting our time wasted talking about rounding errors like Russians on Twitter.
So in your opinion, if we will take this right-wing media, there will be no, what we define as truth decay. We will not be in this cognitive crisis in trying to clarify reality, understanding reality. This is all the problem is there.
In the United States, I'm talking very specifically from detailed empirical investigation of disinformation, misinformation, and confusion in the United States.
This is important, Yochai, this is important. It's not, at least from my perspective, it's not only a US problem. It's a global problem. It's a problem that characterized Western liberal democracies. So how do you see the problem outside the United States?
So let me just, I know I was very aggressive because I was frustrated with listening to all of this. Let me try to anchor this a little bit.
No, this is why we brought you here. We still believe in the free market of ideas. We like doubt.
Itai, you know it sounds better in Hebrew, this tone. We need country-specific studies to understand what happened. I think it's entirely possible, for example, that in India, it's WhatsApp. That's the initial set of studies that suggest that that's true. The problem with those studies is that they don't have the infrastructure to review Republic TV, which is the Fox News equivalent in India. Nobody has the foggiest idea what's happening on vernacular TV in the various regions. And so, of course, if we look in this narrow corner, that's what we think. Colleagues of ours who have looked at 2 countries using our techniques, and our techniques in this regard, both in terms of the amount of data and the cross platform analysis are quite distinctive. In Germany and France, don't find the same degree of confusion. In Germany in particular, there's relatively high trust in public TV. Most of the people have a sense of what's anchored in public TV as the truth, and there's a narrower slice only in the AfD, only in the far right, who does create its alternative existence. In France, the structure is again different. The answer is we need to study each country on its own. We need to get user-side data to understand who's consuming, what they're consuming, how it's affecting them. There is a broad international problem, but that international problem, I think, is not driven by social media, but rather by the collapse of neoliberalism in the Great Recession and the emergence of various radical rejectionist parties, mostly on the right, sometimes on the left, like Syriza in Greece. And it's those parties that are moving aside that are driving this deep distrust in a mainstream. And on top of that, you have media architectures. But that's the claim.
Thank you, Professor Benkler. Dr. Tehila Schwarz-Altschuler is a senior fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute and head of the Institute's Media Reform Program and also the Democracy in the Information Age program. Hi, Tehila. So, Tehila, probably you have a lot to say about this debate, but more specifically, what does the US election teach us about the threats to democracy?
Well, there's so much to say. Maybe I'll start by referring to the first 2 presentations. There's an interconnection between social media and traditional media. So I don't think we can actually separate the discussion of television and social media. I do agree with Professor Benkler that it is different between different countries, but I think that the interconnection or the influence that social media had during the past decade or so on traditional media is not neglectable. So of what we've seen with social media during the past week, I think around the elections at the United States is certainly a milestone. It is very different than what we've seen in 2016. In a way, we can say that maybe 2016, the social media was just a platform. They sold services to whoever was willing to pay. They have exercised their algorithm in the same way they did, in a regular time. At 2020, they became an active player, which is, after all, a milestone. So first of all, we can see social media platforms as the responsible adult. But on the other hand, you can say that was kind of a censorship. They did not erase or remove content, but what we've seen is that they have altered search results, they labeled posts, they downranked problematic content. They implemented a host of measures to ward off what they thought was misinformation. Facebook has pinned the election results to the top of the users' news feeds. It is still appending labels to Trump's post explaining the truth behind the election. Twitter is no longer fully restricting Trump's tweets, but it still continues to add labels warning users that this claim about elections fraud is disputed. Even YouTube is taking action now. It's demonetizing videos from outlets such as the Trump-affiliated One American News Network that claims that Trump won, and yet it certainly can be considered as censorship on the heart of political speech. It's tweets and posts by a president who is a candidate on election week, let's say. So it is a milestone. I think secondly, and here I want to refer to what Professor Benkler just said, I think that what the networks have been doing kind of backed traditional media, because there is an interconnection between TV and social media. And US networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, they all took the very unusual step of cutting away from the president made unfounded the accusation that the presidential elections was being stolen. And in this context of fact-checking and fake news spreading, I think that was one of the most important moments of the entire presidential race, maybe even the last 4 years. And we'll have to think about the consequences of all this, but the question I think I was asked was why all this has happened. And I think that the first reason would be, as you have mentioned, Itai, before, it's COVID. And maybe this is, the biggest difference between Trump and Biden, because Biden represents a presidential invocation of science, wear masks. And Trump represents a presidential invocation maybe of bleach. I think that the networks understood that there is a matter of life and death here. But also the other, I would say, reason for that is the threat of regulation, because social media companies may not have a choice if the government steps in and forces them to make changes. They are under increased scrutiny from the government, not only the American government, it's also coming from Europe to squash misinformation and disclose how the information they see might differ from what others see. So I think that the main question after the elections is not whether to regulate social media, but how to do that. I think that the ship has taken the turn already. I don't know if you want me to refer now to what I think we need to look ahead, or I've been talking enough. Let me just... No.
Maybe short answer. Can you put it in the Israeli context, following what this debate with Yochanan Benkler, but what happened in the United States? Can you put it in the Israeli context?
Well, I want to say something. I hope I'm not going to sound weird. While the social media platforms signed, for example, tweets as premature, and American networks stopped Trump's speeches in the middle, everything that Trump said, without any kind of, I would say, asking hard questions, was published in Israeli media. So I don't know if we're getting into an election year here in Israel, but if social media companies are going to start acting the same way they did in the United States, I doubt it, whether the Israeli traditional media is going to be responsible enough as the American media was. And this is something for me, which is, I would say, a source of concern.
Thank you very much, Tehila. We'll go to Bill Marceliano. Bill is a senior behavioral scientist at RAND Corporation and a professor at the RAND Graduate School. Bill, you are the lead author of Foreign Interference in the 2020 Election, Tools for Detecting Online Election Interference. So first, you are probably referring to threats that are coming from the outside, foreign interference. Did you identify foreign interference in the 2020 election? And if so, what was the interference? Who are the actors? What are their goals?
So we definitely found at least one large-scale election interference effort over social media, and it was aimed at the US 2020 general election. And we found that it matched known Russian tactics. It also matches their overarching theory of reflexive control in this kind of area. It matched their ends. And in particular, the machine learning algorithms we use were trained on prior Russian linguistic samples from Russian trolls. So I don't have a smoking gun, but we're pretty confident it was indeed a Russian controlled and Russian authored effort. And the question about their ends is really important. We found that they had two primary goals. The first of them was to spread hyper-partisan themes and content using both troll and what appear to be botnet accounts working in concert. So the first one really is sowing distrust and dissension by amplifying existing partisan tensions in the US polity. So I'll harken back to what Nina was saying. It's not like they're introducing sort of new, fractures. It's, Americans have these really, really serious concerns about each other and really serious mistrusts around ideology and political identity. And so the first effort was really about boosting those tensions and sort of convincing people that, hey, our side is in a death struggle with either Nazis or socialists, and they can't be trusted. The second part of it seems to have been a preference for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. So we found troll accounts were spreading pro-Trump content within a very large community of pro-Trump supporters who are also sharing a lot of like deep state, conspiracy theories, QAnon content. And then we found within the Biden support community, there were left-wing trolls, but they were actually spreading undermining content about Joe Biden. He wasn't a real progressive. He wasn't actually going to win. Sanders was a better choice. And then finally, we found pro-Sanders content as well. So the three of those we think add up. We infer showed a preference for Donald Trump as a candidate.
And can you measure the impact? Maybe it's too early for 2020, but looking back at 2016 or other elections around the world, is it working? Does it really influence people, convince them to change their vote, increasing their confidence in their candidate? How can you measure the impact of this foreign interference?
So that's a really good question. And you asked sort of two sort of stages or two sort of levels of testing. One is, how do we go from the campaign effort to how it impacts the ultimate goal, like changing votes or sort of changing outside real world behaviors? That's a hard question. And that's a really open question, whether or not these are really effective that way. The intermediate step, which is how do they impact the audience and how do they affect their perception of their candidates or their position? So we, as part of the same large scale study, we also did an empirical investigation. We did a experimental treatment. We exposed people, including self-identified, very liberal and very conservative US voters. And we showed them a range of content that had been out there, including Russian propaganda memes. And we found two really interesting things. One of them is it worked really, really well. If you were really left-wing or really right-wing, you loved the content. You had a strong positive impact. You're like, this is great stuff. And those people said, I'd love to share this. I want to share this with people on social media. The interesting and maybe encouraging thing is that when we showed people the source and they realized it was propaganda, their pleasure in it and their affect went way down and their willingness to share it decreased. So that suggests, one, at least in the sense of impacting people's ideology and beliefs, it's effective. But then secondly, maybe there's an intervention there, is that revealing the source seems to have a powerful impact on people's willingness to be manipulated. People don't want to feel like I'm being worked. And then maybe a second question is this overall, how do we measure effectiveness? And again, there's this whole research area about, advertising and marketing kind of stuff. Trying to scale this up to social media and really measure the impact of campaigns can be challenging. We have used a thing called resonance analysis. It's possible to get a large corpus of data around a propaganda campaign to build a linguistic quantitative model of the specific words and distributions of that campaign, and then look across social media populations over time and say by location, like panel studies, and see, are people adopting the language? We can measure the adoption or the rejection of that language model. Again, it doesn't get us to like, hey, how will you vote? Will you join an organization? Will you act violently? That's an additional step. But we can certainly measure whether or not people are buying the market share because your ideology is bundled into your language. Like anyone who's been a member of an organization that believes in it very passionately, now you can't use some language. So like in the US, for example, if you are very passionate about the legality of abortion, if you're on one side, you have to use words like unborn children and babies because it's implicated in your worldview and your membership. And on the other side, you have to use words like fetuses and women's rights and women's bodies. Again, it's bundled into your advocacy position and the population you're a member of. So the ability to measure that and to see, are people buying into and adopting your language, that is possible. We'll be able to use that at scale on social media.
Thank you very much. Alicia Wanless is the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Alicia, do you see what we are talking about as a new phenomenon, or it's something we've seen in the past in maybe a different structure, a different color?
First, thank you for having me. It's always nice to join a lively conversation. And as for the question, is the problem with disinformation new? The short answer is no. Is there more disinformation today? Probably, but that's also there's also a lot more information in general. That's something we face every time we introduce a new means for processing information, be it printing, television, or web-based technologies. And also, it's difficult to get a baseline of what came before, what was normal. It's really hard to say for certain if there's a rise and to what degree, but that doesn't mean it isn't a problem. So what I would call information pollution isn't new. There have always been people degrading the information environment for their own aims, be it to seek power, proselytize a belief, or turn a profit. Even Thucydides bemoaned that Athenians were believing falsehoods about Spartan governance models. And if you look to a past election in the US, some Southern newspaper editors in the lead up to the 1860 US presidential election spread falsehoods that Lincoln's running mate Hamlin was a mulatto. And there were other horror stories too about what would happen if the Black Republicans won office. So what has changed in a digital age is that information communications technologies have increased the speed of communications and the reach to audiences. The second thing is that these mass communications are now multi-directional, meaning anyone can engage. So it can also help obfuscate their origins, wrapping audiences up more into a form of participatory propaganda. And thirdly, these technologies have really increased the amount of data aggregated on individuals. At the same time, scholarship in psychology grows to help target audiences. But I'd also like to state that disinformation, however, is but one tactic in influence operations more broadly. And an overemphasis on a singular tactic and case studies about them and developing our understanding of the broader phenomenon, it leaves us strategically disadvantaged. So to borrow a military metaphor, we're trying to win a war with tactics alone. And what's desperately needed right now is a way to understand the information environment in general and the disturbances within it, much the same way that we do currently with weather or the physical environment. That would help give us a better range of options to develop proper strategy.
And can you elaborate on this last issue? What is the broader picture? How can we go from tactics to strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way to look at this is that what we're doing is we're operating in a wider information environment. And if this were something like a war, we would be thinking about the terrain in which we're operating, thinking about how the weather patterns might change, and that would give us an advantage. But currently, we don't really think about the information environment in that way. Our entire understanding seems to be quite wrapped up in actors trying to make a change rather than, what is the space in which we're working in? And in terms of countering these things, there really aren't many easy answers. At the partnership, we've been conducting meta studies on things like social media platform interventions. And while those interventions have rose considerably in the wake of COVID-19, there's still little publicly available information on what works and what doesn't. And that's one of the reasons why we're standing up some work streams around measurements. But even with those studies not completed, there are some obvious things that would help towards countering influence operations, including having the political will to do something, which is generally very difficult because many politicians benefit from influence operations. But that high level determination can change things like education, both for youth and adults, for preparing them to live in an information age. But we also need things like better cross-sector collaboration to inform industry on how to counter influence operations while not undermining democracy. Researchers also need to start speaking the same language. I mean, we've thrown around many different terms to talk about things that are very similar, and that's extremely problematic, especially for developing policy. Finally, we need to accept that this problem is very old and very human. It's always going to be there, and society might never be rid of it, but we need means to better mitigate unacceptable influence operations, whatever those are deemed to be. So there's likely no easy answer, not even in technology.
Thank you very much, and we'll probably go back to that. Mr. Agnes Bridgman is a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. Maybe we can now shift from US election, general issues, to more specifically COVID-19. What can you tell us about who was behind COVID-19 disinformation?
So I could switch. I don't want to, though. I want to engage with all this other great conversation, but maybe we can save that for the Q&A. The one thing I did want to say is, like, I think totally Yokai's point about looking at country-specific effects is very important. So I'm Canadian and I study primarily Canada, and it's obviously a completely different ecosystem and completely different information environment from the United States and international communities, but it's very much in the orbit of sort of the English language social media environment. And because of that, I think that there is a lot more, maybe you just undersold it, Yochai, but there's a lot of spillover effects from country to country. I think the infodemic, the pandemic nature of things moving from country to country is very important when we're talking about dis and misinformation. So the question is about sort of who's behind COVID-19 disinformation, and I study online kind of political activism, digital activism, and I think that yes, there's probably some influence operations. There's been so much discussion of China and Russia in the media, and okay, yes, probably there's some of that. That's largely based on anecdote and innuendo, but for sure, the bulk of what we would sort of say like is misleading content or is content that might be contributing to some of these misperceptions is homegrown, is people who are, who care deeply about politics and believe very strongly that they have done their research and that they have the answers and that they can help inform their fellow citizenry. So, in Canada, we have a very high trust population, generally a very high respect for traditional media organizations. But that doesn't mean that there's not a massive number of Canadians who are actively engaged online in trying to sort of make political points, but what we would sort of identify as mis and disinformation. So I think that's
the purpose for that is what is their goal? What is their objective? Why are they doing that?
So I think that the most useful frame to think about this is political participation. These are people who genuinely believe in the information that they're propagating. In a similar way to people might protest or people might write their representative. They are politically participating. They care deeply, and this is sort of what I look at. And I've done large-scale surveys, looked at massive amounts of social media data, and when you talk to social media users who are incredibly active, and I mean like the super users, the people who really care deeply about politics, you ask them, hey, how do you engage politically? And they go, oh, Twitter. That's how I do it. I do it on Facebook. Yeah, I share, I talk to my family, I try to get my ideas out there. What's the purpose of that? Well, they're participating in a free and deliberative democratic society. I mean, if you go to the protests, Canada hasn't had them as large as the United States, but you've seen major protests in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. And if you go to these protests and you talk to people, maybe there's some misperceptions about COVID-19, but they're there because they're patriots and they care and they think that what they're doing is for the good of the country. They're there for freedom. And I don't mean sort of freedom in patriotism and I think the somewhat condescending way it's talked about in the United States amongst sort of the intellectual community, where like patriot is now a buzzword for like, okay, we know what you're about now that you've said the word patriot. I mean people who really believe that they care about their country and are trying to save it from like dictatorship or oppression. So I think that when we say who's behind this stuff, disinformation, in the Canadian context, from sort of the research that we've done, has played a relatively small role, but misinformation and the spread of these ideas is everywhere on social media. So I think sort of the piece that sort of caused the invite to this panel was something published in the Misinformation Review, which was a piece kind of trying to link how and when people consume media to misperceptions they have about COVID-19 and specific real world behaviors that they engage in. And it's very hard to do that link. And there's ways to get at it, but and I could talk for hours about sort of the problems of connecting these things and particularly disparate social media platforms. But basically, you know, and this is no surprise, people who consume more social media and use social media as their primary source of news have many more misperceptions around COVID-19 and are much less likely to engage in sort of recommended social distancing behaviors. I think that's not a surprise, but I think it's useful to sort of really lay that out clearly, that social media is the main way these things are propagated. And we're working on a piece right now that I'm pretty excited about, which is to sort of say, okay, how does this information cross international borders? It's very easy to think about this globalized information ecosystem, but actually, yeah, there's preferences. So for example, Reddit is much larger in Canada and per capita than any other country. So like Reddit is Canadians are overrepresented on Reddit massively. So it plays a huge role in our information ecosystem. Parler has become increasingly popular, and these platforms are driving a lot of this stuff. And I think this is new, and I think this is global, and this is a real challenge. And I mean, I have lots of ideas and things, but maybe I'll leave it there with the 5 minutes unless there's another follow-up question.
Thank you very much. And we'll pass to Ohad Zeidenberg. Ohad is the lead founder of the CTI League, the first nonprofit community that aspires to protect the medical sector against cyber attacks and disinformation. So, Ohad, what can you tell us about the forces, the actors behind COVID-19 misinformation or disinformation?
So, hello everyone, and I'm really happy to be part of this amazing conference. Regarding your question, Itai, the threat actors that trying to spreading fake news, disinformation, misinformation worldwide, it's really hard to determine the specific threat actors because it's almost everyone. It can be state-sponsored attack that trying to leveraging the crisis to make some profit or promoting their interests worldwide. And we see that in the 3 big countries that spread fake news worldwide, that it's Iran, Russia, and China. But also, we see a lot of people that really have truly belief in the disinformation that they're spreading. And I want to cover some of the COVID-19 themes that we identified in the CTI League regarding the pandemic. One of them is COVID isn't a serious problem. COVID doesn't exist, or individual medical targets the medical facilities worldwide and trying to reduce their power. Maybe it's a medical scam or some myths about the origin of the pandemic. Some people that says it's escaped bioweapons or country X created COVID to make or to promote their interests worldwide. It can be crossovers with other conspiracies, and this is really dangerous because when the COVID is involved with the 5G or anti-vax or anti-gates, if I will be more specific, it's really tricky. So people can promote fake news or disinformation about the corona crisis because they have any political interests, but they can also spread the fake news because they really believe in. And to find the origin of the fake news, to find the people that is behind it is really hard because it can be one person, as I said, that really believed that, for example, COVID and 5G has a connection and want to do something about it. But it can be other people, it can be a political entity that trying to make some influence on people worldwide and maybe try to convince something about the US to promote other interests in the world.
Thank you. And maybe as a short answer, can you tell us what actions did you take to counter the spreading of COVID-19 disinformation, the actual measures that were taken by you, by the CTI League?
So really early in the pandemic, we created the CTI League mainly to protect hospitals, but also the medical sector and the life-saving organization worldwide from cyber attacks. And for my region, in the company that I work for as an employee, I covered multiple times disinformation operations executed mainly by Iran. And from there, I have truly believing in analyzing this information with tools of threat hunting and threat intelligence on the matter of cyber attacks. So we really consider the disinformation as part of this map. We created a strong disinformation team with some of the goals that I want to share with you. And the main mission of that is to help to prevent harm directly related to the COVID-19 disinformation, is to support them. In order to support the mission, we gather information about fake news incidents, narratives worldwide, and we try to escalate them to law enforcement organizations, take down notice to the platform that have the power to reduce the level of threat. For example, for social platforms, social media platform, or some other companies that can literally take down malicious media outlet or fake media outlets that are executed by websites. We can alert it to the organization that people spread fake news about them, to get help from media influencer. And we have some tactics to fight the fake news. And in each different incident, we identify what is the best way to answer these fake news incidents. It can be detect, deny, disrupt, degrade the fake news, to slow them down, to deceive, to divert them, to destroy them, and to deter them. It means that we do discourage for the threat actors if we identify them in order to reduce the amount of fake news in the social media, for example.
And Ohad, from an analyst perspective, when you see this disinformation effort in the form of cyber attacks, from your perspective, what is the reason? What is the goal? What they are aimed to achieve?
It can be one of, in my opinion, 6 main digital harms that they can make. They can make physical harm, like literally physical harm, to spread the fake news in order to make people act physical in the real world against people. It can be psychological harm. It can be economic harm. For example, to make a financial loss for an organization, or from a data breach, cybercrime, to promote cybercrime. It can be harm to the reputation of the organizations that under attack of fake news. It can make a cultural harm, or as we started with, political harm. It means that, for example, we have disruption, the political processes in worldwide. It can be various or few goals for the people that spreading fake news. Some of the incidents that we analyzed, for example, were people that tried to promote and executed some unmasked march worldwide. They really asked people to get out from the home without mask and go together as one unit. And it can be a disaster for the world, because this can literally create a second, a third, or another wave of infection. It's really, really dangerous, and we really keep the eye on it.
Thanks, Ohad. And our last panelist is Dr. Ofer Friedman, lecturer and director of operations at King Center for Strategic Communications. Ofer, we talked about political disinformation. We talked about COVID-19 disinformation, misinformation. Do you see difference between, for example, COVID-19 disinformation and the political disinformation? Ofer, you are muted. Get out of mute.
Yes, hello, sorry. Thank you very much for having me here, inviting me. To answer your question, I would say maybe there are some characteristics of information of the content itself, which is different, but on conceptual level, there is no much difference. And continuing what has been said so far by several speakers here, I would like to take some hype out of disinformation. We've been talking too much of disinformation. There is general over-focus on disinformation in general. Disinformation as a political phenomenon has been with us for years. It's a natural part of political behavior. There is very little new on how it used, although indeed, with the development of new information communication technologies, it can be spread faster, it can be produced faster on larger scale, but we actually don't know whether it influences better than printed propaganda of the 19th century. So we need to kind of take it into perspective and understand the general context and understand that disinformation is an inherent part of our personal life and political life. On personal level, we all spread disinformation on daily basis. Like I would like every one of us to think about our profile picture on our websites or Facebook accounts. To what extent this is actual true representation of our face in the morning when we wake up. So on personal level, we all spread this information, which is harmless and it's okay. It's a part of daily life. On political level, it can be more harmful, but again, it's a natural part of social existence. So this is the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is kind of the topic of today's panel is 2020. So you ask us to refer what we have learned, what has happened. So continuing again what Professor Benkler said, and also Alicia and some others, we need to understand that this prism of disinformation of foreign agents that are trying to influence, it's a very limited one. It allows us to see very limited picture of overall political influence conducted by information manipulations. We have been over-focused on this disinformation discourse for two main reasons. The first one is something tangible. We can see it. To see and realize other more complex information manipulations is much more difficult. It's less tangible. Disinformation, on the other hand, which is based on lies, all this disinformation and fake news, it's very tangible and visible. It's relatively easy to trace down, but we also have to remember, and this is the second point, that propaganda based on lies is very bad propaganda. And our opponents, whether those who spread this information, whether those who try to influence politically and manipulate information, they are much smarter and much more nuanced, whether they come in from abroad or they domestic. So what I would say, what we have learned in 2020 is, I think we reached a certain point when we understand this information, we can tackle this information. It's about the time that we move forward to understanding better how political influence via information manipulations works in the 21st century. We need to get rid of this very limited prism of disinformation and try what Alicia was referring to understand how different actors, whether they're domestic and or foreign, and whether this distinction even relevant, trying to create political influence through information operations and information manipulations. So I think we're already there. We already understand it. We know to trace it because it's easy traceable. We know to debunk it with all these networks and NGOs and institutions established to debunk fake news and so on. So we already reached this point. We understand it. We can deal with it. We can point it out. We can also, as one of the speakers said, well, we can actually discover the source to the audience. So I think it's a time where we step forward to a more deep waters of information influence and try to understand how that works.
Thank you very much, Ofer, and that's complete the first round of our discussion. There are some participants that want to comment, and I'll give them the mic in a minute, but there is one general question that I want to put on the table, because not all of us, and I will turn to Yochai in a minute, but most of us believe that threats are coming from the outside and from the inside, and in some way they are coordinated. I'm not talking about collusion or some kind of an organized coordination, but they are echoing each other. In some ways, they are coordinated. So I wonder if the panelists can comment or talk about the ways this coordination is being done, how the outside and the inside, the foreign and the domestic are working together in the same domain. So we'll start with Yochai and then Tehila.
Great, thanks. I think it's important, and I'll try to answer your question partly by moderating a little bit what I said and emphasizing several things that others have said in the panel. I think it's really important to understand the differences between individual level confusion and population level effects, between successful manipulation of groups of hyperactivated people, like Ohad was talking about, if you can get people out without masks to walk around. And we certainly do need to think, as Tehila said, about the interaction between social media and mainstream media. And my primary point is that in large scale election level things that carry huge attention, and when we're talking about population level effects that can shift millions of votes, mass media leads and social media is secondary. There's no question that on the specific issues of does garlic infused water help or something else help, that's you can see much more of social media being purely about that and not about the mass media. Then there are things like hydroxychloroquine, which start to some extent online, but then take off through Fox News to Trump, and then it becomes politically complete. So what we looked at when we looked at all of the assertions about Russian intervention in 2016, which was much more present than in 2020, the interaction that we found, the coordination essentially that we found in the larger effects. So for example, when there were allegations that fake Twitter handles or Facebook groups that were Russian, that came in the Mueller indictment or came in the congressional reports, what we saw essentially was Russian accounts jumping on the bandwagon. Trump had started something, Republican and right-wing media jumped on, and then 72 hours later, you get the interventions that are the subject of the, and that was fairly consistent. We also found one clear example of a Podesta email that was driven on 4chan and then identified by a Sputnik reporter who moonlighted on a blog that then went into InfoWars and Hannity and became all across the right-wing media. So there are examples of those kinds of insertions. It's very difficult to associate them as having had population level impact on the background of sustained disinformation campaign. So if Fox News produces the Clinton pedophilia connection as their most Facebook shared story that's sustained over months and is most linked to by everybody as a source of authority, the fact that there's also a Sputnik reporter moonlighting on a third-tier blog that succeeds in getting a particular insertion of it being part of a satanic ritual as well is less exciting. That's what I mean. So there is this interaction. If you're focused on narrow groups, we can actually trace very specifically where the effects were both on media and on people. And but if you're talking population level effects, at least our research suggests that you need to see mass media first and other things after.
Yes. And maybe just to follow what you said previously, if this is the problem, the way you characterize the problem, so what is the solution? isn't it part of the free market of idea? Isn't it part of the political debate? How can we get out of it?
So maybe this is the explanation for my very forceful intervention when I started, because I think the critical thing is actually not what people in the disinformation business do and how they can be countered. There is no empirical evidence that media literacy has any lasting effects beyond 2 or 3 weeks. Most of the people who consume actively, there's this lovely paper from PNAS from a couple of years ago looking at Russian trolls and interactions with them, and practically everybody is people who already wanted to hear what they were hearing from the trolls, and so they were looking for it. You can say fact check from now till doomsday, that will only prove that you're in cahoots with the bad guys. So that's not going to work. What matters is how mainstream media covers it. Remembering that we overstate the centrality of social media. Take the survey evidence we have about the US itself. 18% of Americans say that social media, all social media, is their primary source of political news. 16% have network news, 13% have local news, TV, network news, CNN. What we need to be able, there's a chunk of the population that is lost because it's inside and only wants confirmation. But the critical thing is for the mainstream, where most people who just don't want to think about politics every day, they just see some politics in their peripheral vision. That's where they get their anchors about what is and isn't reliable. And it's critically important that the mainstream talk about what is the real threat and what isn't, not focus on technology, not focused on social networks. And we saw it actually in the US in the last 2 or 3 months. I think we've seen mainstream media be much more aggressive in being willing to, on the spot, block things, call them false, use truth sandwich. That's not going to affect the people inside the right-wing media ecosystem, but it helps it from diffusing to broader parts of the population that are not as intensively interested in it. And that's the primary vector of action.
Thank you very much, Professor Benkler. Dr. Tehila Schwarz-Altschuler.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about to stick to the elections and what we can learn from it, and try to elaborate on that and see what we can learn. I think that even though we've seen some possible glimpse of light at the end of the, let's say, post-truth tunnel, the end of the election campaign, the end of the presumptive end of Trump's presidency will not bring with it a misinformation ceasefire. And this is, I think, because the hyper-partisanship and the 10 societal factors and the divergent news diet by traditional television, as Professor Benkler said, or at least the divergent, let's say, interpretations of the news, they're all fed back through social media. So this interconnection can't actually be divided. You've asked before about the virtual collusion between foreign actors and internal actors. We need to understand that the information that we get from social media works in a two-level fake, I would say. The first level of the fake is the algorithm of the social media networks themselves. We don't know exactly how the social media algorithm work. That same algorithm that select the what information we see, because the technology, as we all know, is a black box controlled by the respective social media company that build it. And the second level is the manipulation that all different actors are doing on this algorithm. Those are the avatars and the trolls and the fakes and all those things. So we do need to understand that the foreign and local entities are using this double fake system. And as to the question, what we need to do, I do agree with what Ofer has said before. Information will always be a part of an open society. But as the actions of journalists, fact checkers, and the social media companies have shown, I think during the past, let's say 10 days, there are plenty of new tactics that can be used in order to, that we can use in order to fight it. But I want to emphasize that the platforms at this point are huge. They're mature. More than huge, and they have all sorts of resources, all sorts of abilities to figure out ahead of time and certainly monitor afterwards what kind of impact all their algorithmic tweaks are having on users' information and consumption. And this is, I think, an important point. Having said all of that, I think that the main responsibility is on governments, is on local governments, not on social media. 80 years ago, it was television. When governments realized that here comes a new medium, which becomes very influential, they started to regulate it. It's not that we were so good in regulating television. Otherwise, you know, Professor Benkler wouldn't have said whatever he has said before. But we can certainly learn from, or the lessons from traditional media policy and try to see what we need to do now. So if I can just, you know, in a couple of quick points. First of all, we need to rethink traditional media policy. There's this very interesting paper by the Stigler School of Business from the University of Chicago, which was published about a year ago. We at the Israel Democracy Institute have just published a paper about the future of Israeli journalism. So we talk about antitrust, we talk about new business models, we talk about strengthening journalistic professionalism and ethics. I think we need to be very, very careful not to go to the, I would say, the easy place where we're going to allow social media companies give hash money to traditional media. We also can learn a lot of things about the platforms themselves. For example, we need a unification of the community standards. What we've seen during the past days was very different policies. For example, being exercised by Twitter and by YouTube. And as long as you don't have unified community standards, it's going to be very misleading to the public. You need also a very much more intensive work in order to clean social media platforms from fake news and conspiracy theories. I mean, we've seen a lot of stuff being done, but it seems to me that even the platforms continue to implement special measures aimed at reducing the spread of misinformation. It seems a little bit that they're running out of steam already. They don't need to search under the street lamp, I would say, on Donald Trump's personal account. They need to look for the closed Facebook groups where the conspiracy theories actually start before they start spreading. And more than everything, as I said before, there is a huge need of cooperation between governments and social media companies. As much as I'm happy that social media platforms have acted like responsible adults, I think the main responsibility should be put on the shoulders of governments. The discussion as to the limits of freedom of speech should be a local discussion and not an international discussion. I think that would be enough for now.
Thank you very much, Teila. Angus?
This is a really interesting discussion. Thanks for turning to me. I think one of the threads here that we've been talking about is sort of whether or not social media is important or not, and you know, like how much importance we should place on it in our public discourse, how much we should care about it when we're trying to talk about mis and disinformation. Of course, mis and disinformation is not new, but the social media is somewhat new, and you know, we're reaching you know, 10, 15 years of influence now. But I think one of the things that that I would like to highlight, and there's a lot of really good research about the agenda setting capability of social media. And I know how you've done some really great work tracing specific instances, but what stories are covered, what pieces are important to sort of traditional media elites, there is some link. And so, you know, should we put all of our eggs in that basket? Should we just sort of try to regulate social media companies and try to really focus on that as a way to combating this? Well, no, that's not all that we can do. But actually, that's such a huge piece because, I mean, at least in the Canadian context, every journalist, every sort of major news organization is glued to Twitter. I mean, there's numerous studies of this, and they use it to inform what they care about and what's being reported on. The stories explosion, yeah, it's often linked to sort of traditional media anchors, but that continuing conversation occurs on social media and can continue to push it and attention of people. So I think that remains very important. The other thing, I think, it's very difficult to get population level insight from social media analysis, and like early Twitter, like early academic publishing in the Twitter, looking at Twitter was really interesting, trying to predict elections and really trying to understand can we use this to do some amazing things? And no, it turns out we can't really do any of that. But I think part of that is that we're a bit kind of walking in the dark here as researchers. And this is I guess a slightly trite point for somebody who doesn't actively research this, but in my perspective, this is like trying to manage a pandemic. This is like my little homegrown analogy is like, if you think about trying to manage a pandemic and you're looking at hospital admissions and you get like top level aggregates from hospitals around the country, but you have no idea about like individual treatments that any patient has received. And then you're trying to make some sort of or how they've lived their lives or who they've contacted. And you have such this narrow slice of data. And it's actually worse because you have that hospital, but then there's like an alternative medical system, which is, let's say, Twitter, and then there's Facebook, and then there's Parler. You can't really access that. And then there's Reddit. And we are hopelessly outgunned. I don't know if anyone sort of on the call is subscribed to like a Facebook job postings, but like the number of behavioral scientists that they've been hiring in recent years, and not just Facebook, social media companies trying to better understand this. That if you want the good data, if you want to really understand what's going on, you have to be internal to these companies. And that to me is very scary as a researcher. If you are dependent upon the institution you're supposed to be researching on for funding, for resources, and for data access. And there is absolutely no easy solution that I see there. The Canadian government really, during our last election in 2019, put a huge amount of emphasis in trying to get the social media companies to give better data, and they were somewhat successful. And we had a relatively clean election. But like the Facebook ad library is such a great example. If anyone's used the Facebook ad library, and you can see they spent between $1 and $25,000. What am I supposed to do with that as a researcher? How can you possibly use that to inform the public discourse? So that's like, I just will stand on a hill and yell that loudly until, I die.
Thank you very much. And Bill Marceliano.
Thank you. And I wanted to talk back to the original question about sort of coordination of external and internal sort of efforts and how they sync up. But before I do, real quick, Angus, I really echo your concern too about transparency, access to data between platforms and the outside research committee. And it's really irritating to me and confusing because it's so arbitrary. Like Twitter talks to us sometimes. I don't know why. Facebook's like a black hole of refuseniks. We've actually had really good dialogue with Google and with particular Google's Jigsaw unit who have been actively engaged, invited us in. I have no idea why those three platforms are so wildly different in their willingness to collaborate and talk. And that is also a major frustration as well. So I just wanted to double down on that. I'll be on that hill with you yelling as well. But onto this idea of how external and internal efforts sort of sync up. Just as an example, in our study, we looked at a lot of, we had an algorithm identifying sort of troll likelihood. So we looked at a lot of the examples of the ones our algorithm said, hey, these look like trolls. They really look highly rated as trolls. And one of the things I noticed was a sort of parallelism of their messaging efforts and how they really depended on sort of homegrown, beliefs, attitudes, and sort of appealing messages. So one of the less savory, really to me like a low-end tactic, was the circulation by these accounts and the reception of doctored photographs of both former First Lady Michelle Obama and Ivanka Trump and Melania Trump. So if you had these left-wing posing trolls circulating the Trump women pictures that have been doctored and often in very sexualized, misogynistic ways. And those had enthusiastic uptake and were retweeted and recirculated and well received by progressive communities they were aimed at. And then on the flip side, you had these incredibly racist comments and racist and then masculinizing, however to say that, of Michelle Obama, as if she was a man actually, from these conservative posing trolls in these communities. And they weren't introducing this idea. It wasn't like Americans didn't have, on both sides, a willingness to sort of express their ideological position by hating, first ladies on the other side and demonizing them. And so I saw a real confluence and saw many examples of that where clearly these external efforts were piggybacking off of what people wanted to hear, the existing themes and ideas. A good example would be a lot of non-political content from highly ranked right-wing troll accounts was just videos of Black Americans behaving poorly or violently. And there was no direct political message, but along with and inside the stream of anti-Black Lives Matter material, it was clearly meant to be racist and to say Black people are can't be trusted. They're like animals. Here they are fighting. This really, really racist idea, and that's a homegrown reception from that audience. Thank you.
Alicia?
Thanks. Just coming back to the research collaboration with industry, it is a huge problem. And one place to look might be in adapting collaborative research models between defense and academia. Things like the US federally funded research and development centers might be an example that could be adapted to work. I'd also return to what Offer had said earlier too. We need other ways to look at this problem beyond singular tactics and what actors do. And one option is to develop an information ecology. Ecology is essentially the study of the environment, and we need the equivalent holistic approach to the information environment. For example, physical ecosystems tend to experience disturbances, and the same can be found in an information ecosystem. New ideas erupt and they spread, disrupting neighboring communities. Old sticky ideas take root. They can be really hard to change, and they often dig in after a new idea has emerged. There are things like information floods. They occur every time we have a new way to process information, and in tandem tends to follow information pollution, right? So floods of low quality information on a specific idea. And sometimes these do follow different types of events. There are definitely patterns that emerge. So for example, we know that when a crisis happens, people seek information because uncertainty makes it psychologically upsetting for them. If this is happening again and again, we know what type of event will eventually happen. Why aren't we planning better to be prepared for something like a pandemic? The only thing we don't know is when a crisis will emerge, but we can work out how to respond. So for example, relying on public health officials to be heard through the noisy modern information environment isn't enough. The response needs to be coordinated. And we can ensure reliable information is positioned in front of people. Social media platforms did try to help, but that ought to have already been in place before an actual pandemic hit. So we do have the capacity to plan as humans. I think we just tend not to. Thanks.
Thank you very much for all the participants. It's been a very interesting discussion. Maybe two things to take out from this discussion. One, I think we do have a problem of measuring the impact, problem of measurement. Does it really influence the people? Is it a real problem? Whether anyway we define the problem, is it a real problem that have impact on our political culture, political behavior, political discourse? So this one issue of measurement sounds to be very problematic. And the second, though they were offers for possible solutions, I think that most of us are quite pessimistic. Western liberal democracies were built on this free market of idea, on doubt and debate, and this mechanism seems to work. It doesn't work. It seems that it doesn't work in the digital era, and I don't think that we currently have ideas on how to cope with the problem. Though, of course, there are the regulation channels, the education channels, the technological channels, but putting all things together, it's quite pessimistic. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again. We are now shutting down, and exactly on 1800 our time, in about 38 minutes, we'll have the second panel that will be broadcast from King's College and will deal with strategic communication and memory construction. Thank you very much, and good evening from Tel Aviv.
Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Neville Bolt. I'm the director of the King's Centre for Strategic Communications in London at King's College London. And we welcome you to the second panel of today, following the first on disinformation and misinformation and fake news, which those who were fortunate enough to witness it, I think, saw a very stimulating and very successful discussion today. So we're going to take a slightly different tack, and I'll explain shortly. I'll introduce you to our panel of experts. But first, let me just anyway thank our partners, INSS in Israel, for their co-production and putting a lot of hard work and effort into making today possible. And then I welcome all of you around the world who are listening today, and that includes many of my own students from our master's program at King's in strategic communications, who I hope will be supplying us with plenty of constructive input and difficult questions for our panelists. So, memory construction in strategic communications. Okay, let me just give you a little bit of background why we're slightly, it would appear on the surface, diverging from this disinformation theme, although you'll realize quite quickly we're not. It is very easy in the way that strategic communications is applied and understood in today's politics and geopolitics. And by strategic communications, let me remind you what I'm talking about here is the shaping and shifting of long-term discourses, significant discourses in politics and geopolitics. And there is a tendency nowadays to overemphasize the message aspect. This is inevitable because it's about operationalizing and instrumentalizing on the part of states, governments, but also on the part of state challengers, revolutionary and insurgent movements, as well as global NGOs and even major transnational corporations such as big energy companies, high-tech companies, even big pharma companies. So there's a tendency to focus on the message. And perhaps what everybody is missing is perhaps what we should all be doing really is putting on our X-ray glasses and trying to look through strategic communications to see what is the underlying architecture, or if you like, where's the skeleton in the body of strategic communications. And our panelists today, I think, are all of a similar mind, that we need to look at the way that major influencers of discourses and big conversations, the way that they play with time, the way they try to understand time, past, present, and future, as a continuum that is there to be shaped in the business of constructing memories, which is not just about recalling the past, nor is it even just about forgetting the past deliberately. It's about actually shaping it, almost as a piece of modeling clay, and sculpting the past in order to take possession of the past in order to be able to present the official, the common sense understanding of the way things used to be. The reason for that being that those who shape the past at least legitimize their own presence in the present tense, in the now, in search of an attempt to own the future. And so we're playing today with time, with the construction of memory, and we're going to look at it from very different aspects. But at the same time, we're trying to enrich the debate around, I suppose, what is strategic communications? What makes it tick? What's really going on behind this surface level of messaging? So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our 5 distinguished experts, and I'll introduce them in the order of appearance. So we have with us Elina Lange-Yanatamashvili. This is a Georgian name, which I still struggle with. Although Elina is Latvian by birth and still claims to be a very patriotic Latvian, but I think she's also acquired all the trappings of all the good trappings of being a Georgian as well. Elina is a senior expert with NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, which is headquartered in Riga in Latvia, and has a distinguished track record in strategic communications, and is a specialist in memory construction, and particularly how it applies, how it is understood through the medium of film. Second up today is Professor Gadiaia, who joins us from Jerusalem, you're at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and you are in fact a professional sociologist, cultural sociologist, and I think brings a very different dimension to this discussion today. Really unusual understanding of what we need to be talking about. Third up today, Dr. Andrea Elner, who is also from King's College London, but from Defence Studies, but again with, I would argue, with a really quite an outstanding track record, having taught at numerous different institutions around Europe, and in different guises, albeit a security expert, but with a background in literature studies, and also with a very, very wide understanding of how to apply her thinking currently also to cultural and gender issues. And then fourth on today will be Dr. Vera Liefkין-Shapir, who is an author, Israeli, but of Ukrainian heritage, with an expertise in Russian strategic thinking, and is going to introduce us today. In fact, is going to take us down memory lane and to look at the relationship between contemporary Russian thinking in terms of, again, memory construction and strategic communications, and see what relevance the Bolshevik Revolution has to do with that. And then, last but certainly not least, Dr. Vinicius de Carvalho, who is also Mariano de Carvalho, who's also from King's College London, but is the head of the Brazil Institute and is Brazilian by birth and heritage. And I'm not going to tell you what he's going to talk about, quite deliberately, because I think he's going to throw a spanner in the works, as we say. For all our very clever theorizing that you're about to witness in the next 40 minutes, I think, to mix metaphors, I think Vinicius is going to pull the rug from under our feet right at the close. So a surprise in store for us. So enough of me. Let's move on to Elina. Elina, are you happy to begin and tell us what you want to talk about? So I'm going to give you roughly 10 minutes and just remind our audience today that this 2-hour session is broadly split into 2 halves. You'll be hearing in the first hour from our experts, and if I have the time, I'll ask them a couple of questions as well. But in the second half, in the second hour, the floor is open. And that's open to every one of you around the world to ask anyone, within reason, anything. Elena, are you happy?
Yes, I'm very happy. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. What Professor Bolt forgot to mention is that I'm also a documentary filmmaker. And this is why I recently have the habit of bringing the topic of film everywhere. And this is also the reason why my today's topic is about Latvia's centenary and memory construction through film in that context. So my homeland, Republic of Latvia, celebrated its centenary 2 years ago in 2018 with a broad range of activities. And this centenary celebration was particularly important for us as a nation because out of these 100 years, we have been free and independent only for half of the time. And this centenary program included also a state-funded boom in local filmmaking. And many films that were awarded financing touched upon Latvia's complicated history. So I looked at what, why, and how was chosen as important to remember. And when the Latvian government announced this centenary celebration, what they said was, and I quote, that this is an opportunity to celebrate the country's 100th birthday honorably, respectably, and with pride and joy by telling the story of Latvia and creating the future Latvia. However, the word future does not find adequate representation in the centenary's film program. Out of 16 films which received financial support, so 7 documentaries, 5 fiction films, and 1 animation, focus on the past to a greater or lesser extent. And that constitutes 13 films out of 16, so absolute majority. And there has been a public discussion on what influenced the choice of films by the selection committee, but there is no clear explanation of the concentration on the past, since there was no such, so to say, official directive to follow. It just happened that way. And in fact, the government was actually encouraging for the film directors to cover a variety of topics and target, diverse audiences in all generations. So there were 32 proposals submitted in total, and it seems that the filmmakers themselves had chosen to link the thematic of their films largely to historic events, historic personalities, and time periods. And there was very little that spoke of modern-day Latvia, and only 1 documentary film triggers the discussion about Latvia's future. So this, I believe, is directly linked to the current worldview of the Latvian nation, which has been influenced largely by the events of the 20th century, where Latvia continuously had to struggle for independence and its place in the Western world. And it is also linked to the Latvian traditional cultural interpretation of human life and afterlife, where the dead are viewed as existing among the living and continue to influence the present and future. And probably that is why Latvians and Lithuanians are the only nations in Europe who have developed such a rich tradition of caring for cemeteries. It's even to the level of obsession, I would say, and celebrating the dead. And this tradition is directly linked to commemoration practices and sharing of verbal memory, also whilst gathering physically within a cemetery, for example, and thus keeping the memory of a nation alive through different times of turbulence and oppression. And this is how the Latvian language, tradition, and folklore have also survived through this verbal kind of sharing and memory sharing, because the first book in Latvian language was published only in the 17th century, which is very late if you think about it. So preservation of language and manifestations of culture in the vernacular language are key to forming nationhood and the nation state, according to Benedict Anderson. And it has also helped to keep the idea of Latvian statehood alive from the 19th century onwards. and also preserving the forbidden memory of the First Republic of 1918 and an unwillingness to undergo full Russification were also the drivers behind the independence struggle under the Soviet Union. So which historic topics do these 13 films of centenary speak about? I would categorize them as follows. So first is understanding the formation of Latvian statehood. The second theme is identifying national heroes in our past. And the third is survival of the Latvian statehood idea and human dignity under occupation. So I believe that this shows that there is a challenge to form a current Latvian national narrative identity, which would include independent Latvia after the 1991, so the modern day Latvia. And this has also been reflected in the ways how the Latvian political establishment has tried to brand the country internationally and how it has been talking to its ethnically divided electorate. Although the rhetoric is changing, there is still, I would say, no clear vision of the modern day Latvia that would be tied not only to the past, but rather showed the past paving a clear road to the future. So if we try to analyze this from theoretical point of view, then we have to look for an explanation in the understanding of historical consciousness. So namely, how an individual interprets the current based on conglomeration and the dialectic of past experience and future expectations. So my interpretation of the current historical consciousness of the Latvian nation is that it cannot comfortably move forward because it has not gained satisfaction from dealing with its past. In fact, in the short 30 years of regained independence, Latvia has not even grasped all the memory, all the micro-histories of the nation since the early 20th century, because it has almost always been either under occupation or at war, subjected to the so-called correct version of history imposed either by Germany or Russia. And therefore, the past still dominates the present in Latvia in a way that hampers future-oriented thinking. And this idea of microhistory has become particularly topical in the course of the 20th century, interacting with the ideas of post-structuralism and social constructivism, and the understanding that there is no one single national history, but rather multiple socially constructed coexisting realities, calls for a representation of these different memories, which help to assign a variety of meanings to what we would call, Latvian national history. And if we consider Paul Ricoeur's idea about the untold story, by which he means the collection of experiences of memories that we can voice in order to form our narrative identity, then Latvia has several painful memory points which it has problem voicing. And Ricoeur says that once we make a choice and voice these experiences to form our narrative identity, we automatically take responsibility for them. But that can be done only when one feels ready to answer for them. So that narrative identity can also change over the course of time, and that we experience as individuals, as groups, and also as nations. And as Latvia struggles with coming to terms with its World War II legacy and the heritage of the Soviet regime, it is very difficult for the country to form this narrative identity. And interestingly, there are actually very few films which speak about World War II or Soviet period in the Latvian filmography, literally just a couple. And I think it's related to this traumatic memory, because with traumatic memory, there is a need for a period of distancing before such memory can be articulated as part of one's narrative identity. And I think even greater temporal distancing is required for such memory to be represented in film or otherwise. So the last 30 years of Latvian independence have obviously not been long enough. Coming back to the films of the Latvian centenary, another debate that has to be addressed is the suitability of a film as a discursive construct for speaking of history. And the reason why historians do not accept film as a legitimate form to speak about the past is because of the little attention that filmmakers normally pay to detail, accuracy, and causality, focusing on drama instead. However, if you think from the point of view of memory, then film is in fact a very suitable medium, which from the point of view of its elements and construction methods very much relates to human cognitive processes, to the visuality of memory and to formation of a narrative identity. It also constructs and at the same time also manifests what we call collective or social memory. And cinema has been forming our perception of history for the past 100 years, whether we like it or not. And film can play an important role in the construction and consolidation of the collective memory in the imagined community of a nation. The film tells us clearly what we as a nation care to remember and what we prefer to forget. And one has to remember that also outside of Hollywood, even in such small countries as Latvia, film producers and studios are largely the ones who try to understand the supply and demand of what the audiences are likely to watch and what film festivals are likely to accept, and offer therefore relevant films to the market. So I think for Latvia at this moment in history, it is time for hero searching and confidence building, which is reflected in the composition of our centenary films. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take your questions.
Elena, thank you. That prompts so many questions, and that was fascinating, and it prompts so many questions, and I want to come back to you, but I'm not going to do it now, because I think we need to get on a roll here. And what I want to do now is go straight to Professor Gadyayev and to talk about trauma and constitution. Gad, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me open by thanking you for this kind invitation and a roll of amazing speakers. And there is a surprise at the end. The promise is to be fulfilled. Professor Thornhill, a leader in the study of constitutions, stated recently that, and I quote, "The classical theory of constituent power suggests that the legitimacy of a political system is derived from an ex nihilo moment of foundation. Constitutions," he intimated, "come out of thin air. I beg to differ and do so by using the theory of cultural trauma. I suggest that beneath the legal jargon of constitutions lay cultural stories of trauma. Those traumas motivated authors to make sure that they will never recur, the traumas, I mean. The stories of constitutions that leaders often narrate in the preamble of the constitution eternalize a national traumatic memory. For example, some preambles tell of arbitrary taxation, some of ethnic cleansing, while still others about military colonization or the lack of representation under tyranny. Constitutions describe national humiliation and defeat and promise that such traumas will never recur. Consequently, traumatic stories of constitution become the foci and the constitutive driver of national political traditions and collective identities. My theory posits that past traumas constitute national worldviews that color contemporary perceptions and actions. Traumas stand at the basis of national culture and identity as they create narratives of origin, of identity, and of destiny. As Parr suggested, and I quote, "As the social field remembers, grieves, mourns, weeps over, and shares a sense of collective trauma, a political community emerges." I suggest that constitutional authors use traumas to set a trajectory of national sovereignty. In some cases, they made sure that future generations will understand why they codified specific rights. In some cases, they made sure that the trauma and its political lessons will be, and I quote, "constantly before all the members of the social body, so as to remind them continually of their rights and duties." And this quote is from the French Declaration of Human Rights. My theoretical model. Political leaders choose an historical trauma and use it in charting the nation's story of constitution. In the preamble or in the text itself, the authors eternalize the chosen trauma by providing the historical justification for turning humiliation and shame into national sovereignty. In doing so, the Constitution creates justification for the political tradition that they set on track, but also narrates a story of political destiny of a future. Thus, the traumatic justification for the Constitution creates a collective identity for the long haul. The Constitution tells citizens where they came from, who they are, and what they or their nation and country stand for. I'll talk about two cases, Israel and Germany. The Israeli case shows that it is not the trauma itself that pre-writes constitutions. It is the moral lessons that leaders draw from the trauma which determine its moral and political spirit. Israel's declaration sets from World War II and the Holocaust, drawing a set of unique moral and political convictions. The Declaration of Independence from 1948 sets off with the trauma of exile and the longing for the return to the land of Israel. However, it is Nazi Germany and the Holocaust which loom large in justifying the urgent need for a national home for the Jewish people. And I quote from the declaration: "The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness. By re-establishing in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations." The trauma of the Holocaust and the nation's ignorance of Jewish plight led Zionist leaders to constitute Israel on a commitment for national self-defense. Israel's tradition of never again and its emphasis of self-reliance in what concerns its existence emanate from the ashes of Auschwitz. Its emphasis on a strong army with mandatory service also reflects the commitment to stand strong among untrusty nations. The suspicion of other nations also drives its chutzpah diplomacy. Some constitutions avoid mentioning the collective trauma that underlies them. Nevertheless, unmentioned traumas can still loom large over their spirit and clarify why the authors of the Constitution chose to codify specific articles. Such is the case of Germany. The preamble to the Basic Law for the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 never mentions the Third Reich, the Holocaust, or the humiliating defeat in World War II. However, this traumatic history overshadows the spirit of the Basic Law and its articles. As the preamble to the Basic Law states, and I quote, "Conscious of their responsibility before God and man, inspired by the determination to promote world peace as an equal partner in a united Europe, the German people, in the exercise of their constituent power, have adopted this basic law." So after pouring calamity on peoples and nations, German leaders promised that their new political formation will come full circle. They proclaimed responsibility, world peace, and equal partnership in a unified Europe as the main values which will guide the new Germany. However, the trauma of the Third Reich impregnates the German political tradition and its collective identity after World War II. The horrors of the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht make for voluntary participation in a standing army. This is Article 12. The invasion of the Gestapo into people's private sphere motivates an unflinching commitment to privacy. Article number 10. The looting of Jewish homes in Kristallnacht makes for a firm commitment to the inviolability of the home. Article 13. And the expulsion of Jewish citizens and their murder during the Third Reich imprinted the conviction to never allow extradition or the violation of citizenship. Article 16. These and other articles explain Germany's unique position regarding refugees and its current prioritization of peace, human rights, and individual freedoms on all levels. Although repressed, the German trauma pre-wrote and continues writing Germany's unique political tradition and its collective identity. Now let us generalize. Stories of trauma and eventual victory or revolution provide people with existential answers to the questions of life. Who are we? Where did we get from? What is our eternal mission? The story of Constitution, if narrated through the story of trauma, war and revolution, helps uniting people in providing them with clear answers. National ceremonies, school textbooks help inculcating the story of Constitution year by year, forming a national habitus. For the Americans, the core of their national habitus is liberty and the suspicion of all power. For the French, equality and solidarity come hand in hand with liberty. Germans coalesce around a sense of responsibility for human rights, and the Israelis promise that the Holocaust will never happen again. Let me leave you with a final thought. The traumatic moments of their constitution set countries on distinct political trajectories. Those trajectories are only likely to change on the next historical jolt, the next world war, the next occupation of some empire that would send political leaders back to, namely to write anew their story of constitution and hence set a new political tradition and a new collective identity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating and very provocative as well, which is precisely what we're looking for. Just to keep this German theme going, I'm going to move on to Andrea now, Dr. Andrea Ellner. Andrea, are you ready? You're going to talk on a German theme, aren't you?
I am also going to talk about on a German theme, absolutely. Yes, I am ready. I think if Gad and I had tried, we probably wouldn't have fitted together quite so well, because I'm hoping to shed light on the evolution of some of the aspects of German trauma and how the Germans dealt with that in their constitution, and how this shaped the German identity and political culture in the course of particularly the Cold War. What I might mention is that I spent quite a lot of my childhood and was brought up until I started living here in the UK, in Germany. So I was born in Germany, but have lived in the UK, and I'm a British national as well for the last 2.5 decades now. But so I'm sort of Anglo-German in a weird way, which gives me quite a privileged perspective. I will be talking about memories of war over time and look particularly at the German case. But before I start, can I first say again, good afternoon or evening for that matter, some of us already are in the evening, but then also thank you all very much for inviting me to contribute to this conference, and Neville and the King's Center for Strategic Communication specifically for inviting me to contribute to this session. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I will reflect around the example of mainly West Germany, but then branching out into wider unified Germany. I will be reflecting on the contested constructions of memories of war and draw out a number of insights on their relationship with strategic communication. But let me start with a personal memory. As a small child, I was regularly instructed by my grandmother to fold up my clothes neatly in a pile layered in a particular order. She told me this with a remarkable sense of importance. Much later, I asked her why. Her answer was, so you can get dressed in the dark fast. It still took me quite a while to figure out that this was actually in case of an air raid. Then I also knew why she always had candles, matches, and a suitcase in reach. The impact of war can be felt across generations, although it may be necessary to invest intellectual and emotional labor to appreciate the origins of memory and the reasons for its longevity. Although I never asked her, I suspect that my grandmother's concerns were kept alive in part by the biannual nationwide tests of air raid sirens and drills during much of the Cold War. We cannot assume that the truthfulness or completeness of memory, This and the need to contextualize and interpret historical memory allow the past to be used for purposes firmly located in the present. For polities, the construction of memory is codependent with political culture, and that ultimately links it to strategic communication. This malleability also makes representations of the past vulnerable to manipulation. Fake news, or so-called alternative truths, are one of many manifestations of such distortion. Another is partial truth, which brings me to my first key point. Memory is a function of remembering and forgetting. Remembering and forgetting are deeply political. We've already heard reflections on these themes. They carry symbolic meaning. They shape a polity's identity and have legitimizing functions for power. Tony Judd observed in the early 2000s that post-war Europe was built on, quote, founding myths and forgetting, unquote, a form of what he called instant amnesia following experiences of the war and collaboration. This tells us that why, what, and how we remember or forget can depend on evolving political and strategic contexts. And this will shape the context, content, and approach to a polity's strategic communication. Where that balance is struck between remembering and forgetting tells us something about a polity's underlying ethics and self-perceptions, as demonstrated by the discourse around the constitutive dyad of German memories of World War II, and that is war crimes and crimes against humanity on the one hand, and the civilian experience of war on the other. Which aspects of this legacy German governments, elites, and society chose to remember or forget depended on the strategic context and was negotiated over the entire Cold War and beyond in morally often highly charged public debates. The immediate post-1945 wish to focus on rebuilding was also a search for a new identity and a Western alliance, combined with an impulse to forget or at least not confront the shame and guilt of the recent past. And yet, although forgetting appeared to be negotiable at times, the price was a complicated and lasting experience of different waves of fears, which Frank Bies charted in his 2019 alternative history of West Germany entitled Republic of Fear. The English version is due to be published this year. Initially, fears instilled by Nazi propaganda in the last year of the war, projecting vengeance and retribution from witnesses and survivors of German military and civilian atrocities if Germany was to lose the war, lived on in the minds of West Germans beyond May 1945 without justification. They shaped attitudes towards victims and survivors of National Socialism. They shaped attitudes towards the three Western allies and the early evolution of post-1945 polity of West Germany. In the late 1950s, they crystallized over a government campaign for civil defense in case of a nuclear attack. References to the success of air raid protection measures during the war clashed with subjective memories of the devastating effects of Allied air attacks. Memories of the internal enforcement of compliance during the war generated fears of the re-emergence of an authoritarian state since the civil protection campaign was organized centrally. In that light, the Adenauer government's argument that Germany was following the example of the US and other Western allies was received less as an assurance than an indication of Germany yielding to another imposition by these external actors. The persistence of stereotypes of militarized masculinity led to a rejection of sheltering as effeminate. The cover photo of the accompanying public information brochure entitled "Everyone Has a Chance" thus showed a majority of men in business attire, a respectable role for the new civilian German man. The initiative was soon replaced by another. We might see this as a recognition of its failure at strategic communication, and we might discuss why it was dismissed. This case is also symbolic, however, for the tilted balance in public memory of a German wartime diet towards German victimhood amongst the public and national identity reinvention by the government. From the late 1960s, that balance began to be redressed. This was triggered then, as on so many occasions since, in public debates from, I do apologize. I lost my train of thought here, of argument here. Let's try again. This was triggered then, as on so many other occasions since, by interventions in public debates from critical scholars, public intellectuals, students, and some politicians. They persistently forced Germans, the public, other members of the elite, and governments alike to confront their past, acknowledge the guilt of the Holocaust and other atrocities, and recognize the unacceptable degree of continuity of people with a Nazi past in public life. These developments did not replace German fears. They transformed them, for example, into fears for the ability to sustain lived liberal democracy and the fear, or at very least the reluctance, of using military force. The results, one might even argue the success of this transformation of the political culture, could be seen in the reception by large parts of the public and amongst scholars of what Jan Werner Müller called the unfreezing of war memories in the unified Germany. In the course of the 1990s, psychologists found an unexpectedly large number of clients seeking their help with delayed effects of their traumatic wartime experiences as children. Some of these accounts formed the basis of published studies. Over the subsequent decades, other studies followed which collated witness accounts, some based on contemporary Second World War diaries, others on individual recollections later in life. At a political level, modernization and in some cases reconstruction of the infrastructure of what used to be the German Democratic Republic, combined with the anticipation of a series of major anniversaries of World War II events, led to interventions, for example, of political voices in Saxony demanding the recognition of German victims of the Allied bombing campaigns. The focus of many of these interventions on Germans as victims seemed to spell a return to the one-dimensional culture of German war memories of the early period after 1945. And yet, how far the German discourse on the political and moral dimensions of remembering and forgetting had come could be gauged by the critical engagement with these contributions to the public and scholarly debate. For example, Jörg Friedrich's 2004 problematic Popular or Populist History of the Allied Bombing Campaign of 1940–45, entitled The Fire, and an accompanying volume of images were heavily criticized for implying moral equivalence between the Allied air campaign and German atrocities, especially the Holocaust. The overarching tenor of the critical reception has been that there can never be victimhood without acknowledgement of guilt in German wartime memories. Constructing and reconstructing memories of the Third Reich and exploring its meaning for new generations needs to be an enduring project. The continued recognition of this may just be the salient recurring insight on which to conclude. Why? Because there is a moral, philosophical, and political imperative to continue to engage critically with the construction and reconstruction of this memory. That engagement needs to be as constitutive of the political culture of the unified Germany as it became of West German political culture. In this sense, the protection of critical engagement with memory construction from those who seek to forget, is in itself a matter of strategic communication. Thank you very much for your attention.
Andrea, thank you. Again, another fascinating insight into strategic communication and memory construction. I'm going to actually save my questions for later. And at this point, I'm going to actually suggest to all our participants who are waiting eagerly to talk to you that they should already start to, in the chat column, start to write their questions. You're all invited to join in, please do, and start writing now. Thank you. And so I'm going to move straight on to Dr. Vera Michlin-Shapir, who's going to talk to us about the memory of the October Revolution in Putin's Russia. Vera.
Yes, hello, good evening. Thank you, Professor Bolt. Actually, how I was thinking to look at this case is to sort of look at how this artificial separation that happens in Putin's Russia between the memory of the Soviet Union, which is overall remembered as a good experience, and the memory of the October Revolution, which is remembered as a sort of problematic event in Putin's Russia. And I think that this is a good way to look at how the revolution is remembered, because this separation is an extremely odd sort of way of considering this historical periods, historical events, and so on, specifically because the revolution was so important, was so central in the Soviet memory, while the Soviet Union was still existed, and in Soviet strategic communications. So you cannot really imagine Soviet strategic communications without the October Revolution, and that worked both domestically and in foreign relations, in international relations. So domestically, the October Revolution was celebrated in the most important official holiday, which was the 7th of November, and this holiday had a very clear understanding. It provided Soviet citizens a very clear understanding of their past. So the October Revolution ended the evil Tsarist regime and began a new phase in history, a new and better history, a new and Soviet history. And this is where Soviet citizens could place themselves in time and space. And also, very importantly, it had a projection. The revolution has a projection to the future. It sheds light into the future. The revolution happened in 1917, and more revolutions are to come, and Soviet utopia and communist utopia, Soviet utopia will be constructed. Externally, it was also extremely important because the revolution was a sort of benchmark according to which Soviet leaders could place themselves vis-a-vis foreign states. So is it a revolutionary power? Is it a country on the way to revolution? Is it a capitalist state that we have to compete with? So it was a kind of, the memory of the revolution was central, and it was a perfect historical memory, perfect subject for strategic communications in the Soviet Union. What happened in the 90s was that this perfect memory, when Soviet ideology started to unravel, and it happened even before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it created a sort of, it unraveled, it broke into two, the memory of the revolution. So you had competing memories of the October Revolution that actually sprang while the Soviet Union was collapsing. It was already there in the early 90s. In 1991, on the 7th of November, groups of liberals and groups of communists both came out in them demonstrating on the streets. And liberals on that day were holding banners saying, this is the day of national tragedy. The Soviet Union is an evil state. It ought to collapse. And and the October Revolution began a tragedy. Communists on the same day protested against democratic reforms, against Yeltsin and against Gorbachev. So this kind of competing memory of the revolution, it went on in the 1990s. And for these groups, it was very obvious that the revolution and the Soviet Union were bundled together in their memory. Yeltsin allowed for this competition to continue, and he actually didn't remove the holiday from the national calendar. So he tried to rebrand it as a day of reconciliation, to sort of facilitate reconciliation in the public. He was unable to do so, and what happened were these two competing narratives. And in 2000, as we know, along came Putin. And Putin made it known very, very early that he thinks that the Soviet Union was not such an evil empire. It was actually a great time, and we should remember it and cherish the good memories we have from Soviet times. But at the same time, in various quotes by Putin, he mentioned 1917 and 1991, the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the year to which he refers to as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and a great trauma for the Russian people. 1991 is equated with 1917. So it was obvious that he's creating, artificially separating the revolution from the memory of the Soviet Union. And there are also numerous quotes of Putin saying bad things or implying bad things about Lenin, who was cherished in the Soviet Union as the greatest leader, sort of communism with a human face. And it became quite clear that that the revolution contradicts a broader ideological agenda that Putin was putting forward. And his agenda was an agenda of stability, continuity, and unity. And I think that it's important to note about this broader agenda, something that is being lost in the discourses in the West right now. Putin is often being described as sort of an agent of chaos, somebody who tries to undermine order. But the fact of the matter is that in his own mind, he's a status quo player. He's not trying to undermine anything. If anything, if you ask today, Mr. Putin, what is the greatest thing that you think that should happen in international relations? What is your sort of diplomatic goal? He will tell you that he wants to convene the group of 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So he has this vision, this very, very kind of static vision, sort of classical vision of how international relations should be run. And he intervenes and undermines what we see as an international order when he feels that the tide is going against this classical sort of order of 5 states ordering the world, and the tide, basically the tide of rapid globalization. And he is threatened by this side of history. In fact, the revolution is kind of tied for him with these sort of disruptive events. And this problem is not only ideological for Putin, it's a very practical, a very political, obvious problem that happens in the former Soviet Union. And 2004 actually holds the key to understand why 1917 revolution is so problematic for Putin. In 2004, Putin removes from the calendar this 7th of November that Yeltsin kept despite the collapse of the Soviet Union. He removes it from the national calendar. Instead, he introduces a different holiday, the 4th of November, called the Day of National Unity. It's a very significant holiday for Russian strategic communications, but I don't have the time to speak about it. Basically, this is the ultimate forgetting. He wants to really expunge the revolution, not only say bad things about the revolution. He doesn't want the revolution to be remembered at all. And why it happens in 2004? It happens in 2004. It's not coincidental. This is the year when color revolutions began to happen in the former Soviet republics. So the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And for him, revolutions become not only an ideological problem, but a practical political problem in the sphere that he considers as Russia's natural sphere of influence. Again, going back to this understanding of international politics as a kind of 5 states that have natural spheres of influence. And if you think about it today, when you hear rhetoric by Russian officials about the Arab Spring, you hear really very similar themes. If you ask Russians, am I getting a sign from Neville? Okay. You hear very similar themes about the Middle East as well. And actually, what I want to conclude with is that I'm saying that this is not, this kind of artificial separation creates an actual problem for Putin's strategic communication. And the problem is not only because it's a fragmented kind of narrative of remembering something and forgetting the event that brought it about, but also it structures time in a logical way. And this is a real problem for strategic communication. Putin wants to see history as this kind of memory of uninterrupted events, a sequence of events. The problem with that is that they have no future. Where is the utopia? If the memory of the revolution in the Soviet Union was logical because it projected the future, the utopian future, this kind of politics have no future. And this refers to what Professor Bold noted in the beginning, that you want to own the future. And Putin actually forgoes owning the future by expunging this image of the revolution. And this has been noted actually, by other scholars. Timothy Schneider calls it the politics of eternity. Masha Gessen speaks in her book about the future is history, yes, always looking back. So this aversion from addressing the revolution, from addressing progress, from addressing the future is a real Achilles heel in Putin's strategic communication and in his historical memory. And it's not a coincidence that the main oppositionist in Russia, Alexei Navalny, constantly speaks about the wonderful Russia of the future, because he knows that this is the weakness of this regime, that this is a sort of an futureless state of being.
Vera, thank you. I find this discussion so far, I find this really exciting, and so many good ideas that are coming through. What's interesting is we're all clustered around a kind of nation state perspective and the relationship to the populations over time of the nation state. So at this point, it's only appropriate that we should go to Vinicius, who I think is going to problematize this discussion for us. Is that right, Vinicius?
Exactly, Neville. And thank you very much for inviting me to take part of this panel. I feel a little bit uncomfortable because as the last one, and after you said that I would come with something very original, I feel a little bit pressed about that, but let's try to make some sense of what I want to say here. I will be talking today, we have been hearing a lot about past, future, about memory, about dreams of future and visions for a future. But I will be talking today about the people that don't care about past or future. Or basically, they define their identity not because of memorial aspects. On the contrary, they define their identity by the immediacy of the experience. So I will be talking about a group, an indigenous group from the Brazilian Amazonia called Pirahã. I myself haven't been in touch with them, despite having been many times in the Amazonia, many years in the Amazonia. I haven't been in touch with the Pirahãs. I am based in my talk on the studies done by Daniel Everett, a linguist who has spent a long time living with the Pirahãs, describing their language and also understanding their way of life. They lived close to the Maici River in the state of Pará in Brazil, in the middle of the Amazonian jungle. Well, I have learned a lot about them through, as I said, Daniel Everett, and I think what we'll be talking here has connections with, first of all, their language, their culture, and again, the definition of identity that they have. About their language, some specificities that are quite interesting. One of that's about verbal tenses. I will be explaining better about that. They don't nuance as we do in our Western language and or Indo-European language, let's say like that, many aspects of past and future. It's a much more immediate, it's much more present tense language. The other aspect, it's a language that doesn't have any quantifiers, not only numbers, but also any sort of element that quantify aspects of the nature or the reality. The sense of directions is not based on the body-centric, like we have right and left, but in an exocentric, exo-body-centric. So they describe their relations to the world through upriver or downriver, for instance. Their culture, it's quite peculiar also because the relationship with the nature is obviously very remarkable, as I mentioned here, the question of direction. Contrary of what many anthropologists and linguists say, they don't have original myths. They don't talk about mythological past. They don't talk about how they create the world. They don't tell stories, basically. They don't narrate stories. There is no narrative in the sense of what we know as narratives, not only in past events, but also fictionalizing it. And they don't plan more than one day. They will not talk to you about what they will do after tomorrow. They just think about what we have today. So it's a people that do not talk about unexperienced events, such as long past or far futures events, or even fictional topics. So we are seeing how problematic the situation here when we are discussing about memory and the role of memory to build up identities or to communicate through memory aspects and to think about future in strategic communication terms when we don't have really a far future to talk about. So basically, they have an expression that's that we would call perhaps in Western language just now. They would just say what comes into my sight or goes out of my sight. That's their immediacy of experience. And that's, I think, is the most important element that we should keep when we think here, is the immediacy of experience. They only make statements anchored to the moment when they are speaking, rather than to any other point in time. And then come the amazing thing about the verbs, the verbal tense that I said. They use simple past, they use simple present and simple future in the sense of the relative to the moment of speech. So they have no perfect tenses like we used to have in, as I said, Indo-European languages. So only immediate tenses. I will give you an example. We have the sentence in English. When you arrived, 20 generations had already lived in this land. Typical narrative of memory, typical narrative of projecting future also, because give you the sense of historicity. Okay, when you arrived, the verb arrived is fine. You would see that in Pirahan language because it's relative to the moment of the speech. I'm still talking now, there was a moment just before. But 20 generations had lived. This had lived would not fit there, no? Because it's not defined relatively to the moment of speech, but relative to the arrived, to the past already. So just come into conclusion here and try to bring together these ideas to what is, I think it's important here. Yeah, we are so used to discuss memory. We are so used to discuss narratives. We are so used to discuss identity through a model of language, Indo-European language, that gave us these structures of thinking that framed our way of thinking and frame our way of needing memory to define ourselves. But this indigenous group in the Amazon, this ethnic group in the Amazonia, actually are teaching us or telling us that you can have a strong identity as they have. They are not an isolated language in the sense that, oh, nobody have been in touch with them. They have interaction with other people that are non-indigenous people or other indigenous group, but they have quite clear sense of what their identity. They conserved their identity, or they have what we could call, let's say, a tradition, but it's not a tradition based on the sense of memorialistic storytelling. They have a very interesting language that is not permeable as we are used to see many other languages of exchange words or mixing words. No? So this lack of permeability in the language also reinforces the sense of an identity, but an identity that is immanent. It's not transcendent. No, it's not identity defined or marked by memory. And then if we have no eyewitnesses, we cannot translate, we cannot talk about what we haven't lived. Just to conclude, the person who wrote this, that's the book that I mentioned most of the time here, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett. Daniel Everett, when he went to live with the Pirahans, he was an evangelical missionary from US with the mission to learn the language, translate the Bible, and obviously convert these people into Christianity. Well, what happened, and it's a quite beautiful aspect of the book, is when Daniel narrates that actually he lost his faith in the Christianity, in the sense because the Pirahans actually told him that they didn't need to think about salvation in afterlife, and they didn't need to explain their existence in that moment, in the Hinkek Nunk, based on past experiences. They were not imprisoned into this fantastic, wonderful thing that we have called memory. They were free of memory, and that were the strength or their identity. So that's, I think, the shocking aspect that Neville said that I would be bringing here. No, it's like saying, how can we imagine an identity, a people that define themselves without the need of being imprisoned by this memorialistic aspect? You know, especially cultures, as European cultures, or as I said, Indo-European language cultures that framed systematically my sense of meaning. It depends on what happened before to my people and what's the future for my people. Well, Pirahans are living there for generations. They are there before the Portuguese colonizers arrived. They survived that, they survived everything, and they are still there, living as Pirahãs without the need of discussing the role of memory, because what is important is the now that they are living. I will finish here with more open questions than conclusions on that. I think my role is more to provoke us to think about how much language also frame our way of dealing with memory, and what we think that is an experience of the all humankind can be very different if we think differently also on these aspects of language. I hope that it was not so frustrating for you to wait until this end to something that was not what we're expecting as a bomb, but at least I think these ideas will be a very good counterpoint to the discussions that we are having from the beginning of this panel now on memory and the need of memory, and especially how to deal with that in strategic communication. I would put this question, how we can communicate strategically without the need of memory then? Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Vinicius. And that's a great question. But let me just ask you very quickly. So you mentioned the hink and inunk, but the here and now. But so this is experiencing the here and now. But do they actually have the ability or choose to have the ability to step outside themselves and look back in on themselves and to examine the concept of time and space?
That's, again, it's a question that would never fit into that mentality, because that's a question that we have. These questions of in and out, it's framed from our language, it's framed from our cosmology, and even for our ontology. So that's I think the revolutionary aspect of Pirahãs and why they are so peculiar in this sense is that this is not the question that interests them. You don't need to ask about who I am, because, well, I am just part of this nature that live as every day we wake up and we go to sleep. So this sort of immanent experience, it's I think the strongest point here, this aspect of immanence. There is nothing that is outside my immediate experience. I don't have anything that is not immediate experienced. I will not talk about my future or my past, because what I am, it's today.
Fascinating. And it throws everything up in the air, of course, as you say, when it comes to trying to build this theoretical construct around strategic communications. So where are we on time? I'm going to go straight to our other participants who are scattered around the globe and keen to get involved, and they've already been writing to our expert panelists. So let me start with Elino, who spoke to us nearly an hour ago, and I'm looking at a question from Smaranda. So Smaranda asks, apart from films, who controls or shapes collective memory? And she's interested in narrative creators of today, and mentions, are we just looking at filmmakers, or should we be looking at musicians, historians, media, and state leaders?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think the thing with the collective memory is that it's a process that we don't fully understand, and it is all about the interaction and the change that happens when we interact with each other, and we influence the collective memory, and then the collective memory influences us. And it is a kind of a chicken and egg situation. You can't actually tell what came exactly from where. But if you look at what, for example, Maurice Holbach writes about collective memory, if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually emphasizes the importance of the family in the formation of collective memory, because we are most influenced by those people who are the closest to us, and family obviously are the closest to us. And they are also the ones who give us the first introduction to the rituals, and rituals are extremely important for maintenance of collective memory and also for constructing collective memory. But I think if we come back to, for example, to the idea of a nation and to Benedict Anderson and the imagined communities, then as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, that mostly products of, products of culture, what we would call them in the vernacular language, are the ones that form the idea of a nation and this collective understanding and memory. So yes, anything, books, films, music, folklore, and you can expand also on the idea of a language. So I think probably, yes, those two things. Of course, governments can also play a role, but what we have to understand is that they do not operate in a void. They don't start from nowhere, from a blank page. And actually, the more they, dig into the roots of our collective memory, the more successful they are in their communication.
Mm. And Sophia wants to follow up there, Elina, with you, and she's asking whether or not the films that were commissioned or funded by the Latvian state, do they only focus on World War II and Soviet occupation? Are there any other historical events that were drawn out as a way of constructing?
Yeah, actually, I think there was maybe a misunderstanding. So what I was saying is that actually there is very little film that talks about World War II and the Soviet occupation. So these films largely focus on the very first formation of or self kind of conscious understanding of Latvians as a separate ethnic group. Or formation of the idea of the nation. So we would be talking about films that talk about events of, 12th, 13th century, for example, the Baltic tribes. Then we would see films that talk about, 1905, that period. We would see films that talk about the First Republic and the life during the First Republic, which is kind of a, sacred period. And then the Soviet period would maybe be more kind of in the background. So there are films, for example, about the ending of the Soviet Union. That is a film about a family with little girls who are kind of alone in the countryside, and they just hear these events happening on TV and on radio, and that they start getting this understanding that something big is going to happen. Sorry, what was the original question? I got carried away.
I think you're there. And let me move on. Just going back to Vinicius, Russell Smith asks an interesting question. Could a memory-free society ever be constructed now in our present world? Which I think also raises the question of how do they, with their being totally absorbed, existing in the now, the here and now, what happens when that here and now comes into contact with the outside, the broader nation state understanding of time and space?
Yeah, well, I think first, it's difficult to talk about construct societies. No, I think societies, they are a result of a natural process of construction. So I would not say that we can construct a memory-free society. There are societies like this one, that culturally, linguistically, didn't need this sense of memory to make sense of themselves. So what I'm saying is, we are not here talking about paradigmatic change. We are talking here about syntagmatic change in the sense of way of things. We are talking about other cosmologies, other ontologies, other epistemologies that doesn't fit into the categories that we are using. So I'm reading Russell's question here, isolate society. Well, from our perspective, they are isolated, but they are a society by themselves. So I think when we deal with the case of Pirahan, it's really putting in challenge all the sort of questions that we have about how we configure senses of societies. And it's quite easy to us to try to understand or to try to project all over the world we are the same, we are humans sharing the same values and same meanings of what it means to be humans. And again, how they relate to the other societies. They relate with as another being, not necessarily human being. There is one very interesting episode in the book that Everett mentioned that sometimes he was there, but they talked to him. He spoke in Pirahan language, but sometimes they talk among themselves, referring to Everett as he was not there. Oh, like, oh yeah, I asked Daniel something like that. Everybody saw, Daniel is seeing that they were talking about him as he was not there. So the conception and perception of being, it's different from what we are used to look at. Therefore, the relations with outsiders, it's a relation with a total otherness. It's a sense of really otherness, and they are not so worried in search what we have in common and what we need to take from them in the sense. No? That's, I think, what is very revolutionary and difficult to us to really exercise putting ourselves in that position. And just before I finish, I saw the question of Alfredo Crocco, and they don't have tattoos, they don't have any figurative arts either. So there is no sort of transforming this experience in anything that is external to them as well.
Thank you. Giovanna has an interesting question for Gad, which is, Gad, you talk about these major jolts that are required to actually change the trajectory of the way a country perceives itself in its strategic communications. So she's asking you, Giovanna's asking, are there minor jolts as well? Are there more incremental changes that you would consider in your theory?
Well, there are processes of construction and reconstruction always working, but at least in the case of Israel, we speak of traditions that go 3,000 years back. Just to give you a minor example, every year there's a ceremony, the Passover holiday, and there's a process of reading the story of the Jewish people going out of Egypt 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. And we have a short version for the very long night. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. So it's a nutshell of the history of the Jewish people. And small acts of trying to make a change into this very long story are incapable of changing it, because the entire tradition revolves around a national calendar that repeats year after year, ceremony after ceremony. In school, the memory is worked upon on a Jewish calendar that brings up the trauma again and again. So changing that would require changing of the calendar. It's changing of the entire worldview. I don't see small changes making any transformation in this story.
Gad, thank you. Mimi asks the question of Andrea. And Mimi's asking, Andrea, do you have suggestions as to how Germany managed to deal with its wartime past without embellishing or glossing over unpleasant events compared to other countries which have clearly not managed to come to terms with that?
Yes, thank you for that question. The short answer is with difficulty, because it is not a straightforward process. If you look at phases of West German post-war history, and I can't really speak about the GDR and that experience, because being tied into the Soviet universe made for a very different experience for for the public and governments in the GDR, which then translates now in a different and difficult experience in the unified Germany. But West Germany, you had, as I said in my sort of hinted at in my talk, that there wasn't enough time to sort of expand on this. It had an initial impulse to also really not remember very much and not confront. And you get some of this in the debate in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s on the whole question of German war trauma, which then in some ways was criticized and often justifiably criticized for just focusing on the injuries and the trauma of the German population without actually putting it in the context of the German population having supported a government that was ready and very much prepared to launch an aggressive war, commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then only the last years of the war, the tide was turning and then the trauma set in. Now that trauma may be real, but it still needs to be seen in context. You can't really establish moral equivalence there. However, what happened in West Germany is that after the 1950s, where you really had also very much of a focus on focusing on this experience of particularly the Allied bombing campaign and the invasion and the occupation. And the German government trying very hard to reinvent national identity of West Germany and trying to position Germany as an ally in the Western Alliance because that's where it saw the future for Germany. And it wasn't really until the 1960s, and this is where the German 1968 student revolts differed from the student revolts in other countries. They were also concerned about Vietnam, but they very strongly focused also on asking the generation of their fathers and grandfathers, what did you do in the war? Whether that was in the military or in a civilian context, and really highlighting the fact that there were a lot of people with a Nazi past who had not been denazified by particularly American initial efforts in government, down to local government, in industry, in politics, in academia. And so this discourse was really dragged out, this forgetting, that this memory was dragged out from a tendency to want to forget into the present in the 1960s. And once that had happened, it was more difficult to push that back into that particular genie back into the bottle, which doesn't mean that there wasn't a constant veering and hauling between those who very strongly wanted and felt the need and the moral imperative to engage with these questions. There was a veering and hauling between them and those who wanted to forget. And you see that towards the end of the Cold War again, when there were big commemorative events of the Second World War, and the famous huge dispute between historians broke out in the late 1980s about whether it was time to forget. Now, when we're talking about the kinds of crimes that had been committed at the Western Front and the Holocaust and other atrocities, then when do you decide it is time to forget? That is probably something you can never forget. And it may be something that's of relevance for Germans, but also for other countries. And it was these internal dynamics of Germans wanting to understand why it happened and what the consequences were for the new generations. And in a sense also the degree of forgiveness that happened after the end of the Second World War, when the Marshall Plan was applied to Germany, when Germany was accepted gradually into the Western fold, which was partly a strategic calculation, simply because Germany was the front line in the Cold War. But the government took that as an opportunity, but also saw the responsibility. And I think that is partly one of the reasons why Germany was able to do this. If you're thinking about Japan as a comparator, it is different. And so I have discussed these questions with Japanese people, and one of the striking explanations I once had was that the way in which the Japanese approached the end of the Second World War was very much through a sense of preserving one's own honor, which meant that's one aspect of why committing suicide and killing others was part of this, because there was this idea that it was dishonorable not to rather die than be captive, for example. And I suppose the other big element was that Japan could see itself, and was victimized through the atomic bomb. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a massive impact. And so that there were two different narratives overlaying each other, and they were in conflict with each other, and one probably hindered the remembering and the critical engagement with one's own immediate past, because of the experience of being a target for 2 atomic bombs. I suppose these are sort of some of the key elements that distinguish Germany, but for Germans it was very much, it became almost a habit in public memory, in public discourses, to question and to ask and to see the responsibility. And then in addition to that, there was a world looking at Germany, holding Germany to account, and very rightly Israel was very much holding Germany to account. That didn't happen in the same way to Japan. And so if Germans wanted to shun their responsibility, there was someone there who said, no, you cannot shun that responsibility, and they had every right to do that. So I think it was this mix of factors which played together, which forced Germany to actually see what's been going on. And if I look at other discourses, the post-imperial discourse in the UK, for example, there's a much greater reluctance to see and acknowledge that the other perspectives might highlight failings of the past, which ought to be highlighted. You know, whether we're talking about slavery or the history of Ireland, or general imperial past, colonialism, there is a lot of reluctance to engage with that as critically, because there's no external. Germany lost the war, and it lost the war quite decisively, and there were other powers forcing Germany to see what it had done. And that was a good thing, ultimately, I think.
So Andrea, consequently, Alex is asking you, is Germany crippled by its Vergangenheitsbewältigung? Does it hold back, he says, from taking a more assertive role on the global stage, very much at a time when Germany needs to come to the fore and offer some kind of leadership?
Yeah, that's been a running theme for Germany since really just before the financial crisis. And it's got Germany in very hot water with the Greeks, for example, where that didn't go down well very much at all. So I think the German position on the question of leadership is the world probably had enough of a German leader, then called the Führer, and so it's not going to lead from the front. However, so this question is actually not just a 21st century question. It arose fairly quickly over the EU's aspirations to become a military active power, to become a peace builder or at least conflict manager with regard to the Bosnian scenario. And Germany made a few missteps at the start, but then there were also diplomatic missteps. But then there were also calls for German active engagement in a military realm, which from a German perspective was horrific, because the pacification of German society and German approaches to German German approaches to political problems, including foreign and security policy, had been quite comprehensive. And there was a very strong mistrust of Germans of their own sort of power. And they did not really, they were not keen to throw their military weight around. And that was justified, because I think if Germany had got militarily more involved in the Balkans than it did, and it did get involved, but very much behind the scenes in the margins, then a whole host of World War II memories and factions and alliances and memories of those would have almost inevitably been dragged back into an already bubbling cauldron of the descent into war in several Yugoslav republics. So staying out of that was a good thing. What Germany did do in 2015, for example, was to say, right, we have a serious migration crisis here, and we need to help these people because they are either migrants because of war, or asylum seekers because they are persecuted, and there is a legal right to asylum, which is very close to Germany's heart. But there is also a legal right in Germany, there is a right to be protected from war. So the Germans took in huge numbers of people in 2015. And then they were left alone, almost entirely. There weren't that many countries that also queued up to say, yeah, let's help this whole, we collectively through NATO and our actions in Libya, for example, we also helped create this problem. Syria was a long-term consequence of the involvement in Iraq. Germany stayed out of this, maybe justified in the long term because it didn't exactly go particularly well. So German leadership sometimes is more from behind than from the front, and that's for good reason. For example, by staying out of certain endeavors, which hasn't necessarily made Germany very many friends, because sometimes Germany is also seen as not being prepared to pay the blood price for what is deemed to be a desirable collective security policy, or the enactment of a desirable security policy through the use of force. The other thing Germany has done, or the current German government has done over the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, is to emphasize very strongly in its interaction with the US under President Trump that Germany stood for liberal democratic values and was going to defend them in the face of American different ideas about how America should engage and conduct itself under a Trump presidency. And I conclude on this. I heard the other day before the elections in the US, an ambassador to, I think it was a former ambassador to the UK, saying, well, everyone really has been very happy to say, well, President Trump is a bit strange, but we need to engage with him. He has some good points, and we need to engage with him because America is an important power. Germany did not. They just stonewalled, and they did not want any engagement. And I must say there are very, very, very few moments when I'm a little bit proud of being also a German. But that was a moment where I thought that is standing up for principles. That is standing up for a principle that is very much the result of the long-term digestion of what happened during the Nazi era. And I think that's a good thing. And I thought that was another way of showing leadership, which then doesn't force others to come along. But if others wanted to join, then they would be more than welcome to join. So I hope that goes some way towards answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. Before we close our live broadcast, I'd just like to direct a question which is actually written for Gad, but I'd like to direct it at everybody. Because very shortly we'll close the live broadcast, but we're going to continue with all the students until the top of the hour. So Harry wrote a question for Gad, and he said, is it possible to imagine? So think of this as the kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from what Vinicius has been talking to us about. Is it possible to imagine a process of constructing supranational constitutions based on traumatic memory that transcend borders? Big thinking. Can we conceptualize some form of international constitution even that would be based on trauma experienced by humanity as a whole? For example, pandemics or climate change. So first to Gad, and then I'd just like to hear what all our other experts have to think about that.
Well, yes, and I think we do have examples like the UN Charter for Protection of Children, for example, from 1947, I think. And that comes from collective traumas that go beyond national borders. So one can imagine coalitions, international coalitions, which create accepted norms, and you know, we have the code of conduct in war, which is an international agreement of what you can do in war and what you cannot do in war. So those are examples that actually provide a good example. So yes, you need a good trauma to create an agenda that unifies different nations around an agenda. It is possible, it happened in the past, and it might happen in the future as well. Let me just make a footnote for Andrea's take. Israel and Germany have launched bilateral relations as early as 1956. Ben-Gurion and Adenauer, it took 10 more years until formal diplomatic relations were created, but as of 1956, collaborations between the two countries, especially in science, took place. And then we have cultural collaborations. Yet, even 70 years later, when you speak to Israelis, they have something, some memory, some problem dealing with Germany. It would not be on a person-to-person basis, but Germany as a concept is still remembered sometimes Germany is terrifying. It's inconvenient to be in Germany. You have memories coming, surprisingly, what Sigmund Freud talked about, the return of the repressed. Israelis feel whilst in Germany that something they don't want to remember comes back again. And that's the memory of the Holocaust. So even after 70 very good years of collaboration between Germany and Israel, the memory is still very active.
Let me open that, put the same question to Vera. Vera, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So kind of a human trauma that sort of brings people together. I mean, I think and I think this is a theme that came up in the questions that we see in the chat. I think that actually, and there were a couple of questions about sort of how memory is, how social networks impact memory, and whether authoritarian leaders look to the past because they need this kind of unifying power to memory. And I think that's really what happens today, and this is something that Putin, for instance, somebody like Putin would really not like, is actually what Alina started with in the beginning, is that we see more and more micro narratives. So because trauma is subjective, and because we're living in an age where the power of communications with the rest of the world is sort of fragmented, is given to everyone. So it's actually an age of enhanced micro-narratives. So you have more and more micro-narratives. You have more and more subjective understandings of trauma. You have more and more of these kind of conversations going on. And so I think that actually we're heading in a different direction and the people who are kind of trying to bring us to the pole of kind of having a unified understanding of of how we perceive ourselves, of how we look to the future, that are actually people who are more in the, who are more in the realm of Putin, or some kind of a neo-authoritarian understanding of history. And what you're seeing now is kind of this more and more fragmented. There was a comment here also about kind of the personal narrative, that the personal narrative is the only real narrative of trauma that people today can sort of relate to in a more pure way. So I think that this is a direction that we're heading towards, and I don't think it's a particularly bad one. I do think, though, that it does have a problem again, and this is a problem that I've discussed in my presentation. It does have a problem that shares with others who construct memory in a kind of more backward-looking way, sort of looking back, is that where is it taking us? I mean, this variety of voices where they're not kind of brought together by institutions that are trusted and mutually agreed on, like constitutions, which are really, constitutions are creatures of, say, a more classical age. So when we don't have that, when we don't have these streams that bring us together, then we're heading. I mean, where is this heading in terms of narratives? And maybe it's actually we are being freed of this kind of more oppressive memory, as maybe we are heading towards that kind of direction of more like a state of being in the present, and we're not actually acknowledging that this is what technology is doing to us right now.
Vinicius, just a very quick point from you before I actually have to wave goodbye to our live broadcast listeners.
I'm sorry to jump there, but it's another subject that I would like to bring, different from what I said. What Neville didn't say is I'm a musician in my second life, my second ontological existence, and I conduct orchestras and choirs. And 2007, I performed in Brazil with 150 children, the children opera called Brundibar by Hans Krasa. This opera is quite connected to the memory of the Holocaust because it was performed 52 times in Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czech Republic by children that were prisoners there. We translated this opera into Portuguese with one survivor from Teresine who sang while she was a child there. And I was having deep discussions with myself, what is the ethics of memory involved in performing this opera in Brazil in 2007 with children in Brazil that actually haven't even studied about Holocaust yet. So this question of the ethics of memory, I think is a quite important element to bring into this discussion. And I think if we can manage to move this macro memory, especially these macro traumatic memories, into micro experiences of sometimes like the opera static one, I think we manage also to help to share this sense of one collective memory, if we would call like that, but that support a transition for a less oppressive history if we look in future. And I would strongly recommend the book by an Israeli philosopher, Avishai Magalit, called exactly The Ethics of Memory.
Thank you, Vinicius. On that note, we're just going to wave goodbye to all our live viewers because for them it concludes the first day of this international conference. We'd like to thank you for attending and participating, and the second day will take place next Thursday at the same time. Once again, many, many thanks to you.